Close your eyes and imagine waking up in a world where the color gray isn't just a shade. It's a way of life, where the walls have ears, where standing in line becomes an art form, and where a simple loaf of bread tells a story more complex than any novel. Tonight, we're stepping back through the Iron Curtain into a place that existed not in some distant fantasy, but right here on Earth, less than 40 years ago. A place where 70 years of history unfolded like a slow-motion dream. Or perhaps a nightmare, depending on who you ask. The Soviet Union. Just saying those words conjures images, doesn't it? Red banners flapping in the cold wind, stern-faced men in fur hats standing atop Lenin's tomb, bread lines stretching around city blocks. But tonight, we're going deeper, way deeper. We're going to walk through the actual daily existence of ordinary people who called this place home. We're talking about the smell of their morning tea, the weight of their secrets, the peculiar rhythm of life under a system that promised paradise but delivered something else entirely. So settle in, get comfortable, and if you're enjoying this journey through history, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for dreamless timelines. Trust me, you're gonna want to stick around for this one. And hey, drop a comment below telling us what aspect of Soviet life fascinates you most. We read every single one. The story begins not with a bang, but with a knock on the door at 3 in the morning. It's 1937, Moscow. Winter has Moscow in its grip, and we're talking about the kind of cold that makes your lungs hurt when you breathe. The kind of cold that feels personal, like the universe itself has beef with you. Inside a communal apartment on Arbat Street, 7 families share what was once a grand bourgeois residence. Each family gets one room, just one. They share a kitchen, a bathroom, a hallway lined with coats that never seem to dry. In room number 4, Mikhail Antonovich Petrov sleeps fitfully. He's a clerk at the Ministry of Heavy Industry. 32 years old, married to Natasha, father to little Sasha who's just turned 5. Mikhail is what you'd call a true believer. He wears his party pin with genuine pride. He honestly, truly believes that they're building something new, something better than what came before. He remembers the stories his father told about the old days under the Tsar, about the landlords and the priests who bled the peasants dry. The revolution saved Russia, his father always said, and Mikhail believes it. But belief doesn't protect you from the knock. When it comes, and it always comes eventually for someone, it's not loud. That's the first thing that surprises people. You'd think the secret police would pound on the door like they're trying to break it down. But no, it's polite, almost gentle. Knock, 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 3 times, measured, professional. That's how you know it's them. That's how you know it's the NKVD. Mikhail's eyes snap open in the darkness. His heart is already racing before his conscious mind even understands why. Natasha's hand finds his under the thin blanket. Her palm is ice cold. They both know the sound. Everyone knows the sound. In the other rooms of the communal apartment, people are awake now too, listening, praying to a God they're not supposed to believe in anymore that the knock isn't for them. The knock comes again, same door, their door. Now here's where the story gets really interesting, because what happens next isn't what you'd expect from watching movies about the Soviet Union. Mikhail doesn't panic. He doesn't try to run. There's nowhere to run to anyway. Instead, he does something that tells you everything you need to know about what it meant to live in that time and place. He gets dressed, carefully. He puts on his good shirt, the one Natasha ironed just yesterday. He puts on his tie, his party pin. He kisses his wife on the forehead and whispers, "It's a mistake. I'll be back by morning." But see, the thing is, deep down in that place where we keep the truths we can't speak out loud, Mikhail knows he's probably not coming back. Not by morning, maybe not ever, and yet he still straightens his tie. He still puts on that party pin. Because to live in the Soviet Union means to live with contradictions so massive they could crush you if you thought about them too hard. When Mikhail opens the door, there are 2 men standing there in long dark coats. They're young, probably younger than Mikhail. One of them has a thin mustache that he's obviously trying to grow in, trying to look older, more authoritative. The other one won't meet Mikhail's eyes. They show him a paper. Mikhail doesn't really read it. What's the point? The words swim in front of his eyes. Suspicion of counter-revolutionary activity, Trotskyite sympathies, pending investigation. "Can I say goodbye to my son?" Mikhail asks. The one with the mustache shakes his head. Better not to wake him. And that's the last time Mikhail Antonovich Petrov sees his home. Just like that. No dramatic scene. No struggle. Just a man in his good shirt and his party pin walking out of his life at 3 in the morning, while his 5-year-old son sleeps and dreams of whatever 5-year-olds dream about. In the room next door, behind a thin wall that might as well be made of paper, Anna Sergeyevna sits up in bed and listens. She's a widow, 58 years old, who shares her room with her adult daughter. They hear the door close. They hear footsteps in the hallway, then silence. Anna crosses herself, an old habit from before the revolution that she can't quite break, even though such gestures are dangerous now. She whispers a prayer for Mikhail, for his family. Then she lies back down and stares at the ceiling, knowing that sleep won't come again tonight. This is how it works. This is the texture of life during what they'd later call the Great Terror. Between 1936 and 1938, somewhere around 700,000 people, maybe more, maybe less, the numbers get fuzzy when governments try to hide them, were executed. Executed, not arrested, not imprisoned, executed. And about 1.5 million more were sent to the camps. The Gulag, that word that would become synonymous with suffering. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind. Let's go back to the beginning to understand how a country got to the point where a knock on the door at 3 in the morning became just normal. We need to understand where this all started, how dreams of paradise turned into nightmares, how hope transformed into fear. The year is 1917. Russia is getting absolutely wrecked in World War I. We're talking about casualties that would make your head spin. The Russian Empire is bleeding soldiers by the millions. At the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, the Russians lost over 170,000 men in a single engagement. At the Masurian Lakes, another 200,000. These aren't just numbers. These are fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. Every one of them leaves behind grieving families, devastated villages, fields that won't be plowed, because the men who should be plowing them are rotting in Polish mud. On the home front, people are starving, literally starving. The war has disrupted agriculture. The railroads are being used to move troops and supplies to the front, not food to the cities. In Petrograd, that's what they called St. Petersburg back then, bread prices have tripled. Women spend hours every day standing in line for a loaf that might not even be there when they reach the front of the queue. Coal is scarce. People are freezing in the brutal Russian winter. Factories are shutting down because there's no fuel. Workers are being laid off just when they can least afford it. The Tsar Nicholas II is about as clueless as a ruler can be. The dude's off playing general at the front while his wife Alexandra is back in the capital taking advice from Grigory Rasputin, this crazy mystic who claims to be able to heal their hemophiliac son. Rasputin has more influence over government policy than he should, and the aristocrats hate him for it. They eventually kill him, poison him, shoot him, throw him in a river, but the damage is done. The monarchy's credibility is shot. In February 1917, actually March by our calendar, but February by the old Russian calendar they were using, everything explodes. It starts with women. International Women's Day, February 23rd. Female textile workers in Petrograd go on strike. They're demanding bread, demanding an end to the war. They march through the streets and other workers join them. Factory workers, metal workers, students. Within days, there are hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. The Tsar orders the army to suppress the demonstrations. But here's the thing, the soldiers are sick of the war too. They're sick of dying for a cause they don't understand, for a Tsar who doesn't give a damn about them. When ordered to fire on the protesters, many of them refuse, some of them join the protests. The Petrograd garrison mutinies. Suddenly, the Tsar doesn't have an army anymore. Nicholas abdicates on March 2nd. Just like that, 300 years of Romanov rule comes to an end. He's sitting in his railway car and they hand him the abdication document and he signs it. He probably thinks he'll retire somewhere quiet, live out his days in peace. He's wrong about that, but we'll get to it later. For a brief moment, a beautiful, fragile moment, it looks like Russia might become a democracy. A provisional government is set up, led by liberal politicians and moderate socialists. They're talking about elections, about a constituent assembly that will write a constitution. They promise freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, all the good stuff. The Russian people, for the first time in their history, taste freedom. But there are problems, big problems. The provisional government decides to keep Russia in the war. They think they can rally the country, push through to victory, honor their commitments to Britain and France. This is a catastrophic miscalculation. The Russian people don't want to keep fighting. They want peace, they want land, they want bread. The provisional government promises these things will come after the war is won. The people are tired of waiting. Meanwhile, there's another power structure emerging, the Soviets. These are councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants that spring up in cities across Russia. The Petrograd Soviet is the most important one. It's a chaotic, democratic mess, hundreds of delegates arguing and voting and trying to figure out what the hell to do. But it has real power because it controls the workers and the soldiers. Into this chaos steps Vladimir Lenin. He's been in exile in Switzerland, and the Germans, clever bastards, put him on a sealed train and send him back to Russia. They figure he'll stir up trouble, maybe knock Russia out of the war. They're right. Lenin arrives at the Finland station in Petrograd in April 1917 and he immediately starts agitating. His message is simple: peace, land, bread. End the war, give land to the peasants. Make sure everyone has enough to eat. It's a message that resonates. Lenin's Bolshevik party is small, radical, and incredibly well organized. While the other socialist parties are dithering, trying to work with the provisional government, the Bolsheviks are clear: overthrow the government, establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, build socialism. It's an appealing message if you're a worker or a peasant who's sick of getting screwed over. Throughout the summer and fall of 1917, the provisional government stumbles from crisis to crisis. They try to launch a military offensive in July. It's a disaster. Soldiers desert en masse. The government almost falls. Alexander Kerensky, the head of the government, barely holds on. In September, there's an attempted coup by a right-wing general named Kornilov. It fails, but it scares the left and radicalizes the workers. By October-November by our calendar, October by theirs, it's confusing, just go with it. The Bolsheviks are ready to make their move. On the night of October 25th, Bolshevik Red Guards, workers' militias, and sympathetic soldiers seize key points in Petrograd. The Winter Palace, where the provisional government is holed up, is stormed. There's barely any resistance. The whole thing is almost anticlimactic. The October Revolution, one of the most important events in 20th century history, is basically a coup that succeeds because hardly anyone is willing to fight for the government being overthrown. Lenin and the Bolsheviks are now in power. They immediately start issuing decrees. The decree on peace calls for an immediate end to the war. The decree on land abolishes private ownership of land and gives it to peasant communes. The decree on workers' control gives workers a say in how factories are run. On paper, it all sounds great. In reality, implementing these decrees in a country that's collapsing is going to be a nightmare. The Bolsheviks schedule elections for the Constituent Assembly, the body that's supposed to write a democratic constitution. The elections happen in November. The Bolsheviks lose. They get about a quarter of the votes. The Socialist Revolutionaries, a peasant-based party, get the majority. Lenin's response is telling. When the Constituent Assembly meets in January 1918, Bolshevik soldiers shut it down after one day. Democracy in Russia lasts exactly one day. Lenin's justification is that the Soviets represent true democracy, not some bourgeois parliament. It's a rationalization, but it works. Now Russia is in a civil war. Actually calling it a civil war almost undersells it. This is a civilizational collapse. You've got the Reds, the Bolsheviks and their supporters, fighting the Whites, a loose coalition of everyone who opposes the Bolsheviks. The Whites include former Tsarist officers, liberals, moderate socialists, nationalists from various ethnic groups. They all hate the Bolsheviks, but they can't agree on what they want instead. Some want the Tsar back, some want a military dictatorship. Some want democracy. They're united only by what they oppose, not by what they support. To make things more complicated, foreign armies invade. Britain, France, the United States, Japan, Poland, they all send troops. They're supposedly there to keep Russia in World War I, but really they want to strangle the Bolshevik Revolution in its crib. They're scared of communism spreading. So you've got British troops in Arkhangelsk, American troops in Vladivostok, Japanese troops in Siberia. It's a mess. And then there are the Greens, peasant armies that are fighting everyone. They don't want the Reds or the Whites. They just want to be left alone. There are warlords carving out little kingdoms. There are bandits taking advantage of the chaos. The country is fragmenting. The war is brutal beyond belief. Both sides commit atrocities. The Reds shoot suspected counter-revolutionaries. The Whites massacre Jews in pogroms, blaming them for the revolution. Entire villages are burned. Hostages are taken and executed. The infrastructure collapses. Railroads are destroyed. Bridges are blown up. Factories shut down. And then there's famine. A famine so severe that people resort to cannibalism. The Volga region is hit especially hard. In 1921-1922, maybe 5 million people die of starvation. 5 million, children with swollen bellies, adults reduced to skeletons, people eating grass, bark, leather. There are reports of people eating human flesh. The Bolsheviks, to their credit, accept foreign aid. Herbert Hoover's American Relief Administration feeds millions of Russians. But millions more die. Disease follows famine. Typhus sweeps through Russia. Cholera, Spanish flu, smallpox. The healthcare system has collapsed. There aren't enough doctors, aren't enough medicines. People die of diseases that should be treatable. The Russian population in 1922 is significantly smaller than it was in 1914. We're talking about maybe 10 to 12 million excess deaths from war, famine, and disease. 10 to 12 million. Let that sink in. The Bolsheviks win the civil war, but the victory is Pyrrhic. Russia is devastated. The economy has collapsed to a fraction of what it was before World War I. Industrial production is maybe 15% of pre-war levels. Cities are emptying out as people flee to the countryside looking for food. Money is basically worthless. Inflation is insane. People are bartering. Lenin, pragmatic as always, realizes that full communism isn't going to work right now. In 1921, he introduces the new economic policy, NEP. It's a partial return to capitalism. Peasants can sell their surplus grain. Small businesses can operate. The state keeps control of heavy industry, banking, foreign trade, the commanding heights of the economy, but allows some private enterprise. It's ideologically impure, but it works. The economy starts to recover. People start to eat again. But Lenin doesn't live to see the full recovery. He has a series of strokes starting in 1922. By 1923, he's effectively incapacitated. He dies in January 1924. His body is embalmed and put on display in a mausoleum in Red Square. A weird, quasi-religious thing for an atheist revolutionary, but that's the Soviet Union for you. With Lenin dead, there's a power struggle. The main contenders are Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Trotsky is the intellectual, the brilliant orator, the architect of the Red Army's victory in the Civil War. He believes in permanent revolution, in spreading communism worldwide. Stalin is the bureaucrat, the organizational genius, the guy who sits on all the committees and controls the party apparatus. He's not as flashy as Trotsky, but he's more ruthless. He believes in building socialism in one country, making the Soviet Union strong first before worrying about world revolution. Stalin wins, it's not even close. By 1927, Trotsky is expelled from the party. By 1929, he's exiled from the Soviet Union. He'll spend the rest of his life in exile, writing polemics against Stalin, until an NKVD agent murders him with an ice axe in Mexico in 1940. But that's getting ahead of the story. Stalin consolidates power. By 1928, he's the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union, and he has big plans, huge plans. He wants to transform the Soviet Union from a backward agricultural society into a modern industrial powerhouse, and he wants to do it fast, faster than any country has ever industrialized before. The first 5-year plan is announced in 1928. The goals are insane. Stalin wants to increase steel production by 300%, coal by 200%. He wants to build entire new cities in the middle of nowhere. Magnitogorsk, a steel city in the Urals built from scratch. Komsomolsk-on-Amur, a city in the Far East. Massive hydroelectric dams, tractor factories. The Dnieper Dam, the Moscow Metro. Projects that would take decades in any other country, Stalin wants done in 5 years. Where does the money come from? Where do the resources come from? From the countryside, from the peasants. Stalin launches collectivization in 1929. The idea is to consolidate millions of small peasant farms into large collective farms, kolkhozy, that will be more efficient, more productive, easier to control. The state will provide tractors and other machinery. Everyone will work together. Output will soar. That's the theory. The reality is a catastrophe. See, a lot of peasants don't want to collectivize, especially the more successful ones, the kulaks. A kulak is supposed to be a rich peasant who exploits his neighbors, but in practice, the definition is fuzzy. If you own a couple cows, you might be labeled a kulak. If you hired laborers during harvest, you're a kulak. If your neighbors don't like you, you're a kulak. It's arbitrary. Stalin decides to liquidate the kulaks as a class. Those are his actual words, liquidate, and when Stalin says liquidate, he doesn't mean argue with them or negotiate, he means destroy them. Between 1929 and 1932, somewhere around 2 million kulaks and their families are dekulakized. They're stripped of their property and exiled to remote regions. Siberia, Kazakhstan, the far north, places where there's nothing. No infrastructure, no shelter. Just emptiness. The deportations happen in winter. Families are loaded onto cattle cars with minimal belongings. The journeys take weeks. People freeze to death on the trains. When they arrive at their destinations, assuming they survive the journey, they're dumped in the wilderness and told to build settlements. No tools, no materials, no food. They're expected to somehow survive. Many don't. They die of cold, hunger, disease. Children especially. The mortality rates among dekulakized families are horrific. The peasants who remain, who are being forced onto the collective farms, resist in the ways they can. Some slaughter their livestock rather than hand them over. If they can't keep their animals, nobody gets them. Seems spiteful maybe, but put yourself in their shoes. Everything you've worked for your entire life is being taken by force. Your land, your animals, your independence, all of it gone. What would you do? The slaughter is massive. In 1929, there are about 30 million horses in the Soviet Union. By 1933, there are less than 15 million. Cattle numbers drop from 70 million to 38 million. Pigs from 26 million to 12 million. Sheep and goats from 147 million to 50 million. It's an agricultural catastrophe. The Soviet Union loses half its livestock in 4 years. Collectivization is chaos. The most productive farmers are being exiled or killed. The remaining peasants are demoralized, resentful. The collective farms are poorly organized. Nobody knows who's in charge or what they're supposed to do. The party officials sent to run the farms are usually urban workers who don't know anything about agriculture. They issue ridiculous orders based on ideology rather than reality. And then there's the extraction. The state needs grain to feed the workers in the new industrial cities. The state needs grain to export, to sell abroad, to buy machinery for the factories. So the state sets grain requisition quotas for the collective farms. The quotas are based on inflated production figures, because local officials always lie about how much they're producing, so they're impossible to meet. But the state doesn't care. The grain is collected anyway. Armed requisition brigades go into the countryside and take what they can find. Granaries are emptied. Peasants seed grain, the grain they need to plant next year's crop, is taken. Their personal reserves are taken. Everything is taken. The result is famine, but not just any famine. One of the worst man-made famines in human history. It hits Ukraine especially hard, but also the North Caucasus, Kazakhstan, parts of Russia. Between 1932 and 1933, somewhere between 3 and 7 million people starved to death. The estimates vary, and the Soviet government spent decades trying to hide the true numbers, but we're talking about millions. Millions of people dying of hunger in a country that was once the breadbasket of Europe. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like on the ground. It's early 1933, a village in Ukraine. Let's call it Pidkaminka, though it could be any of thousands of villages. The winter wheat didn't get planted because there was no seed grain. The harvest from the previous year was confiscated entirely. There's no food. In a small hut, barely more than a single room with a dirt floor and a thatched roof, a family is dying. The father, Petro, was a farmer his whole life. Strong man, could plow a field from sunup to sundown. Now he's lying on a wooden bench, too weak to stand. His belly is swollen, the paradoxical swelling that comes from starvation. His eyes are sunken, his skin is grey. His wife Oksana is barely better. She's trying to make soup from nettles and tree bark. There's no nutrition in it, but at least it's something to put in their stomachs to trick their bodies into thinking they've eaten. Their 3 children, ages 8, 5 and 2, are listless. The baby has stopped crying. That's a bad sign. When starving Barbies stop crying, it means they're close to the end. Petro knows he's dying. He knows his family is dying. He's angry, furious, but there's nothing he can do. The village has been sealed. Armed guards patrol the roads leading out. Nobody is allowed to leave. The official reason is to prevent the spread of grain theft, but the real reason is to prevent people from fleeing to the cities where there might be food. The state wants to hide what's happening. Starving peasants staggering into cities would be embarrassing. Some people in the village have resorted to eating grass. Others have eaten their leather shoes, their belts, anything remotely digestible. There are whispers of worse things, of people eating the flesh of those who have already died. Nobody wants to believe it, but when you're starving, when your children are starving, when death is the alternative, people do things they never thought themselves capable of. Petro dies on a Thursday. His body is carried out and laid in the street with the others. There are dozens of corpses now, maybe hundreds. Nobody has the strength to bury them properly. When spring comes, brigades will be sent from the cities to clean up, to bury the dead in mass grave, but for now they just lie there. Oksana and the children last another week. The baby goes first, then the 5-year-old, then the 8-year-old, the daughter who had been such a bright, lively girl. Oksana dies last, alone, in a house full of corpses. This scene is repeated across thousands of villages. Entire communities are wiped out. In Kazakhstan, the famine is even worse proportionally. Something like 40% of the Kazakh population dies. 40%. The nomadic way of life that Kazakhs had maintained for centuries is destroyed. People who had herded animals across the steppes for generations are forced onto collective farms, and when the farms fail, they starve. And through all of this, the Soviet press denies there's a famine. The newspapers are full of stories about record harvests, about the success of collectivization, about happy peasants on thriving collective farms. Foreign journalists who try to report on the famine are expelled or denied access. Walter Duranty, the New York Times correspondent in Moscow, writes articles claiming there's no famine, that Western reports of starvation are exaggerated. He's covering for Stalin, and he wins a Pulitzer Prize for it. History won't be kind to him. Some journalists do get the truth out. Gareth Jones, a Welsh journalist, travels to Ukraine and documents what he sees. He publishes articles describing the famine, but they're dismissed as propaganda by those who don't want to believe. Malcolm Muggeridge, a British journalist, also reports on it, but his articles are ignored or suppressed. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is exporting grain. While millions starve, the state is selling wheat abroad to earn hard currency to buy machinery for the factories. Stalin knows about the famine. He has to. Reports are coming in, but he sees it as necessary. The peasants are resisting collectivization, so they need to be broken. The industrial drive requires resources, so the grain must be exported. The needs of the state override the lives of individuals. This is the logic of totalitarianism. By 1933, the worst of the famine is over, not because the state relents, but because so many people have died that the population has been reduced to a level the remaining food supply can sustain. It's a horrific equilibrium. Collectivization is declared a success. The party line is that the Soviet Union has successfully transformed agriculture, eliminated the kulaks, and created a modern, socialist agricultural system. The human cost is never acknowledged, never discussed. For decades, the Soviet government will deny that the famine even happened. Even today, the full truth is still being uncovered. But let's step back for a moment. While all this horror is unfolding in the countryside, something else is happening in the cities. The Soviet Union is industrializing at a breakneck pace. New factories are going up, new cities are being built. The 5-year plan, despite its human cost, is producing results. Magnitogorsk is a good example. In 1929, it's just a mountain, Mount Magnitnaya, rich in iron ore in the middle of the Urals in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing there, no town, no infrastructure, just a mountain and the steppe. By 1932, there's a city, a steel mill, tens of thousands of workers. It's a construction site and a city and a factory all at once. The workers come from all over. Some are volunteers, young communists eager to build socialism. They're true believers and their enthusiasm is genuine. They live in tents, in barracks, in mud huts. The conditions are brutal. Winter temperatures drop to -30, -40. The work is dangerous, industrial accidents are common, but they're building something. They're part of something bigger than themselves. That sense of purpose sustains them. Others are forced laborers, kulaks who have been deported, prisoners from the growing gulag system. They work because they have no choice. Their conditions are even worse than the volunteers. They're expendable. If they die, there are more where they came from. The work goes on 24 hours a day, 3 shifts. The factory never stops. Blast furnaces roar. Molten steel is poured. The smoke and soot turn the snow grey. Everything is grey, the buildings, the streets, the sky, but steel is being produced. The quotas are being met, or at least the reports say they are. In reality, the quality is often poor, the output less than claimed, but the facade of success is maintained. Similar scenes are playing out across the Soviet Union. In Stalingrad, a tractor factory is being built. In Moscow, the metro and underground railway system is being constructed. The Moscow metro becomes a showcase project. The stations are ornate, decorated with marble and mosaics and chandeliers. They're supposed to be palaces for the people, and in a way they are. They're beautiful, far more beautiful than any utilitarian transit system needs to be. They're a statement. The Soviet Union can create beauty, can create modernity, can rival anything the West has. The human cost of all this construction is immense, but it's hidden. The workers who die in industrial accidents, who freeze to death, who are worked to exhaustion, they're statistics if they're counted at all. But the achievements are real. By the end of the 1930s, the Soviet Union has become the world's second largest industrial power, behind only the United States. It's a staggering achievement, even if the methods were brutal. Now, let's come back to the cities, to the lives of ordinary urban Soviet citizens who aren't building dams or working in steel mills. Let's talk about what daily life actually looked like for someone living in Moscow in the mid-1930s. The communal apartment, the communalka, is the basic unit of urban Soviet life. Before the revolution, Russia's cities had a housing stock built for a much smaller population and for a class-stratified society. The rich lived in spacious apartments or townhouses. The poor lived in crowded, squalid conditions. After the revolution, the Bolsheviks confiscate the homes of the rich and redistribute them. But instead of giving each family its own apartment, they cram multiple families into what used to be single-family homes. So you've got what was once a wealthy merchant's apartment, maybe 6 or 7 rooms, now housing 6 or 7 families. Each family gets one room. They share the kitchen, the bathroom, the hallway. Privacy is non-existent. Conflicts are constant. Let's walk through a typical communalka in the Arbat district of Moscow. It's 1935. The building is pre-revolutionary, solid construction, but showing signs of decay. The front entrance leads to a dark stairwell. The paint is peeling. There's a smell, a mixture of boiled cabbage, tobacco, and something indefinable that comes from too many people living in too little space. You climb to the 3rd floor and enter apartment number 7. The door opens into a hallway. Along the hallway are doors to individual rooms, each marked with a family name. At the end of the hallway is the shared kitchen. Room 1 belongs to the Ivanovs. Stepan Ivanov is a factory foreman, 45 years old. He lives here with his wife Maria and their teenage son Alexei. Their room is about 12 feet by 14 feet. Against one wall is a large bed where Stepan and Maria sleep. Against the opposite wall is a narrow cot for Alexei. There's a table, 2 chairs, a wardrobe, and a small shelf with books and a radio. That's it, 3 people, 1 room. The Ivanovs have been here since 1920. They've seen neighbors come and go. Some moved to better apartments, party connections help with that. Some were arrested during the purges and never came back. The Ivanovs keep their heads down. Stepan goes to work, does his job, attends party meetings when required. Maria works as a seamstress. Alexei is in school, doing well. They don't make trouble. They don't attract attention. That's how you survive. Room 2 is occupied by the Kovilovs, a young couple with a baby. They got married last year and there was no other housing available, so they moved into this room when the previous occupant, an old woman who died, was cleared out. The room is even smaller than the Ivanovs, maybe 10 by 12 feet. Dmitry Kovilov works as an accountant at a textile factory. His wife Svetlana used to work as a typist but stopped when the baby was born. Now she's home with little Misha, who's 6 months old and cries a lot. The crying carries through the thin walls. Everyone in the apartment hears it. Some neighbors are sympathetic, others are annoyed. But what can you do? Barbies cry. That's life in a communalka. The Kovalovs' room contains a bed, a crib made from scrap wood, a small table, and a trunk for their belongings. They hung a sheet across part of the room to create a tiny amount of privacy for changing and bathing the baby, but it's symbolic more than functional. You can hear everything through those walls. Everything. Arguments, lovemaking, snoring, crying. Life has no secrets in a communalka. Room 3 belongs to elderly Vera Petrovna, a widow in her 70s. She used to share the room with her husband, but he died 3 years ago. Now she lives alone, which is almost luxurious by communalka standards. She has the space to herself. Vera is retired, gets a small pension. She spends her days reading, knitting, and listening to the radio. She's seen a lot in her life: the revolution, the civil war, the famine, the purges. She knows when to keep her mouth shut. Her room is a time capsule, filled with pre-revolutionary furniture, photographs of relatives long gone, icons hidden in a drawer because displaying them would be dangerous. Room 4 is where our friend Mikhail Petrov lived before he was taken away. Now it's occupied by Natasha Petrova and her son Sasha, living in the uncertainty of not knowing if Mikhail is alive or dead, whether he'll ever come back. The room feels emptier now, haunted. Natasha has taken a job at a munitions factory to support herself and Sasha. She leaves early in the morning, comes home exhausted at night. Sasha, now 6 years old, is being raised partially by Vera Petrovna, who watches him after school. The old woman has taken pity on them. Rooms 5, 6, and 7 house other families: a bus driver and his wife, an engineer with 2 daughters, a party official who keeps to himself and makes everyone nervous. 7 families, about 25 people total, sharing 1 kitchen and 1 bathroom. The kitchen is where most of the drama happens. It's a large room by communalka standards, with a single long table, several chairs, and a stove with 6 burners. There's a schedule posted on the wall indicating when each family gets to use which burner. The schedule is supposed to prevent conflicts, but it doesn't really work. Someone always needs to cook at the wrong time. Someone always leaves a mess. Someone always uses someone else's dish or pot. The arguments in the kitchen can get heated. Maria Ivanova and Svetlana Kovalova have an ongoing feud over whose turn it is to clean the shared area. The party official in room 7 rarely uses the kitchen. He eats at cafeterias or is fed at work, but when he does, everyone defers to him. Nobody wants trouble with a party member. He could make things very difficult with 1 phone call. The shared refrigerator, a rare luxury that was installed just last year, is divided into sections with chalk lines. Each family gets a shelf, but things go missing. A piece of butter disappears. Some eggs vanish. Nobody admits to taking anything, but everyone suspects everyone else. Trust is in short supply. The bathroom situation is even more fraught. 1 bathroom for 25 people. 1 toilet, 1 sink, 1 bathtub. There's a morning rush that would make rush hour on the Moscow metro look calm. People line up in the hallway at 6 in the morning, waiting their turn. The water is sometimes cold. The toilet is often occupied for what seems like forever. Tensions run high. Bathing is a weekly affair for most people. You heat water on the stove in the kitchen, which takes planning and coordination, then carry it to the bathroom and fill the tub. It's a production. Kids get bathed first, then adults. The water gets reused. By the time the last person bathes, the water is lukewarm and dirty, but you make do. There's no privacy in a communalka, but there's a strange kind of community too. The families know each other's business intimately. They've seen each other at their worst, sick, angry, grieving, but they've also helped each other. When someone is arrested, the neighbors might quietly provide food for the family left behind. When someone is sick, others pitch in. When a baby is born, everyone celebrates because a birth is a moment of hope in difficult times. But there's also suspicion. The walls are thin and you never know who's listening. The party official in room 7, is he reporting on his neighbors? Maybe, maybe not, but you have to assume he is, so you watch what you say. You don't complain about the government. You don't question the wisdom of Stalin. You don't mention that your cousin was arrested or that your brother fled to Poland. You keep those things to yourself. Every apartment building has its informers. The building superintendent, the dvornik, often reports to the NKVD. He knows who comes and goes, who has visitors, who's acting suspiciously. He's a powerful person, the dvornik. You want to stay on his good side. This is the texture of urban Soviet life in the 1930s. It's crowded, uncomfortable, tense, but it's also normal. This is what life is. You adapt, you develop strategies for navigating the shared spaces. You learn to tune out your neighbor's arguments. You learn to sleep through the baby's crying. You learn to bite your tongue when you're angry. You learn to live with very little privacy and very little trust. Now let's follow a typical day for one of these families. Let's take Dmitry Kovalov, the young accountant. It's a Tuesday morning in April 1936. Dmitry wakes at 6 to the sound of the alarm clock, a wind-up clock that's one of the few valuable possessions he and Svetlana own. The baby is already awake, fussing in his crib. Svetlana is trying to soothe him, half asleep herself. Dmitri gets dressed quietly. He pulls on his trousers, his shirt, his jacket, all worn but clean. Svetlana takes pride in keeping their clothes mended and presentable. He leaves the room and joins the queue for the bathroom. There are already 3 people ahead of him. He waits, shifting from foot to foot, trying not to think about how badly he needs to pee. When his turn finally comes, he rushes through his morning routine. Splash of cold water on the face. A quick shave with a straight razor, no time for careful work, just enough to look presentable. The toilet, then back to the room to grab his bag and coat. Svetlana has managed to get the baby back to sleep. She's exhausted. She hardly sleeps anymore. The baby wakes every few hours, but she doesn't complain. What good would complaining do? This is life with a baby. This is what she signed up for. She whispers to Dmitri to have a good day at work and tries to grab another hour of sleep before Misha wakes again, demanding to be fed. Dmitri heads to the kitchen. He's got time to make tea and toast some bread. He puts the kettle on the burner assigned to his family for the morning slot. While the water heats, he cuts a slice from the loaf of black bread they bought yesterday, waited in line for an hour to get it, and places it in the shared toaster, watching it carefully so nobody else can claim it. Maria Ivanova is in the kitchen too, making breakfast for her family. She nods at Dmitri. They have a cordial relationship, though not a warm one. In a communalka, you maintain polite distance. Too much friendliness can lead to expectations, to requests for favors you can't afford to give. Too much hostility makes daily life unbearable. Polite distance is the sweet spot. Dmitri's tea is ready. He drinks it black, sugar is precious and they're running low. The bread is toasted. He eats quickly, standing by the window. Through the dirty glass he can see the street below. People are already out, heading to work, to the tram stop, to wherever they need to be. Moscow is waking up. He rinses his cup in the sink, leaves it on the drying rack and heads out. Down 3 flights of stairs, past the dvornik who's sweeping the courtyard. Dmitri nods to him. The dvornik nods back, watchful. He's always watchful. The walk to the tram stop takes 10 minutes. The morning is crisp, spring is coming, finally. The winter was brutal as always. Dmitri pulls his coat tighter and walks briskly. The streets are crowded, workers heading to factories, bureaucrats heading to offices, students heading to schools. Moscow is a city of workers now. The aristocrats are gone, the bourgeoisie are gone. This is a city of the proletariat. The tram stop is packed. The tram arrives already full. Dmitri pushes his way on. You have to push. If you're polite, if you wait, you'll never get on. Inside, bodies are pressed together. It's uncomfortable, slightly claustrophobic, but it's efficient. The tram rattles through the streets, making stops, people getting on and off. Dmitri stares out the window, lost in thought. He's thinking about the factory accounts. There's a discrepancy he noticed yesterday. The numbers don't add up. The raw materials received don't match the output produced. It's possible there's theft. It's possible there's just sloppy record keeping. But it's also possible that someone is sabotaging production, and if that's the case, he needs to report it. But if he reports it and he's wrong, he could be accused of making false accusations. But if he doesn't report it and someone else discovers it, he could be accused of covering it up. It's a no-win situation. This is the constant calculation of Soviet life. Every decision has risks. Every action has potential consequences. You're always trying to figure out the safest path, the path that minimizes your chances of attracting negative attention. It's exhausting. The tram reaches Dmitri's stop. He pushes his way off and walks the final few blocks to the textile factory where he works. The factory is a massive brick building, several stories high, with smokestacks that pour grey smoke into the grey sky. Inside, it's noisy. The sound of looms clacking, machines whirring, people shouting to be heard over the din. Dmitri's office is on the 2nd floor, a small room he shares with 2 other accountants. It's cramped but relatively quiet compared to the factory floor. He hangs his coat on a hook, sits at his desk and pulls out the ledgers. The work is tedious but important. Every ruble needs to be accounted for. Every transaction needs to be recorded. The central planners in Moscow rely on these records to make decisions about production targets and resource allocation. But the reality is that the records are often inaccurate. Factory managers lie about production numbers to meet quotas. Workers steal materials to sell on the black market. Dmitri does his best to keep accurate books, but he knows that the system is fundamentally flawed. Everyone knows it, but nobody says it out loud. Mid-morning, there's a break. Dmitri and his colleagues go to the factory cafeteria for tea. The cafeteria is a large, utilitarian space with long tables and benches. The food is cheap but not particularly good. For lunch later, Dmitri will get cabbage soup, a piece of fish and bread. It's adequate, it fills your stomach, that's what matters. During the break, the conversation is careful. Dmitri's colleagues talk about the weather, about their families, about the upcoming May Day celebrations. They don't talk about politics. They don't complain about shortages or low wages. That would be dangerous. You never know who might overhear and report you. One of Dmitri's colleagues, an older man named Boris, mentions that his son has been accepted to university. This is a big deal. University admission is competitive. It's a pathway to a better life, to a professional career. Boris is proud, and rightfully so. Everyone congratulates him. This is the kind of good news you can share safely. The workday continues. Dmitri enters numbers into ledgers, checks invoices, makes calculations. It's mind-numbing work, but it's stable. He has a job. He gets paid. In the Soviet Union of the 1930s, that's more than many people can say. The factory workers on the floor below him work harder under harsher conditions for similar pay. Dmitri's job is easier. He's lucky. At 6 in the evening, the workday ends. Dmitri puts away his ledgers, pulls on his coat, and joins the stream of workers leaving the factory. The tram ride home is just as crowded as the morning ride. He's tired now, his eyes hurting from staring at numbers all day. He thinks about Svetlana and the baby. He wonders how her day was. He feels guilty for leaving her alone all day with Misha. But what choice does he have? They need his income. When he gets home, he finds Svetlana exhausted but trying to smile. The baby has been difficult today, crying almost constantly. She managed to get some laundry done, washing diapers in the bathtub, hanging them to dry in their room. The room smells of damp cloth. It's not pleasant, but it's reality. Barbies generate a lot of laundry. Dmitri takes the baby from Svetlana, gives her a break. He rocks Misha, walks around the small room, makes soothing sounds. Gradually, the baby calms. There's something about the deep rumble of a man's voice that Barbies respond to. Misha's eyes start to close. Dmitri feels a surge of love for his son, mixed with anxiety. What kind of world is this child growing up in? What kind of life will he have? Svetlana goes to the kitchen to prepare dinner. They have potatoes, always potatoes, and a small piece of sausage she managed to get yesterday. She'll make a simple meal, something filling. In the kitchen, she encounters Vera Petrovna, the old widow who's boiling water for her own dinner. They chat briefly about nothing in particular. Vera offers Svetlana some tea leaves, a small kindness. Svetlana accepts gratefully. Dinner is quiet. Dmitri, Svetlana, and the baby, who's now awake again and fussing, eat together in their room. They sit on the bed, the food on a small tray balanced between them. The sausage is mostly fat, but it's protein. They share it carefully, making sure each gets an equal portion. This is how you live on a tight budget. Nothing is wasted. Every crumb matters. After dinner, there's a little time before bed. Dmitri reads the newspaper, Pravda, the official party newspaper. It's full of the usual propaganda. Articles about workers exceeding production quotas. Praise for Stalin's wise leadership. Reports of saboteurs and wreckers being uncovered. A story about how the Soviet Union is the most advanced nation on Earth, how life is getting better every day. Dmitri doesn't believe most of it, but he reads anyway. You're supposed to stay informed. You're supposed to know the party line. At work, at social gatherings, you might be asked your opinion on something in the news. You need to have the correct answer ready. Svetlana mends one of Dmitri's shirts. The elbow is wearing through. She patches it carefully, her needle flashing in the dim light of their single lamp. She's good at this, at making things last. In Soviet society, where consumer goods are scarce, the ability to repair and maintain is valuable. By 9, they're ready for bed. The baby is fed, changed, put down in his crib. Dmitri and Svetlana lie in their narrow bed, pressed close together more out of necessity than romance. The bed creaks. Through the wall, they can hear the Ivanovs' radio playing softly. From down the hall, voices murmur. Someone is arguing, someone else is coughing. This is life in a communalka. This is life in the Soviet Union. It's not glamorous, it's not comfortable, but it's stable in its way. You wake up, you go to work, you come home, you eat, you sleep, day after day, week after week, month after month. The rhythm of it becomes almost hypnotic. But beneath the surface, there's always tension, always fear, because you never know when the knock might come, when someone might denounce you, when you might say the wrong thing to the wrong person, when your luck might run out. Now, if you're still with me on this journey through Soviet history, I'd love it if you could hit that like button and leave a comment. Tell us what you're finding most interesting. Tell us if you have family stories from this era. Your engagement helps us keep making these deep dives into history. And don't forget to subscribe to Dreamless Timelines for more content like this. Let's talk about what happens when someone in a communalka gets arrested. Let's go back to that night when Mikhail Petrov was taken away. The knock on the door at 3 in the morning, the NKVD officers, the quiet departure. In the morning, everyone in the building knows. They heard the knock. They heard the door open and close. They know what it means, but nobody talks about it, not openly. When Natasha emerges from her room, red-eyed and shaken, the neighbors avoid her gaze. It's not cruelty, it's self-preservation. To show sympathy for the family of an enemy of the people is to risk becoming suspect yourself. But behind closed doors, there's whispered conversation. What did he do? I never thought Mikhail was the type. You never know about people. We should be careful. Everyone is reassessing their own behavior, their own words, their own associations. If Mikhail, good, loyal Mikhail, could be arrested, then anyone could be. The party official in room 7, a man named Grigory Semyonovich, makes a point of being seen avoiding Natasha. He walks past her in the hallway without acknowledgement. This is strategic. He needs to demonstrate that he has no sympathy for the family of a traitor. He needs to protect his own position. Natasha is now in an impossible situation. Her husband has been arrested. She doesn't know the charges. She doesn't know where he's been taken. She doesn't know if he's alive or dead. But she knows that association with him makes her dangerous to others. She knows that people will distance themselves from her. She still needs to work. She still needs to feed her son. But finding work becomes difficult. Her employer at the textile factory where she worked as a seamstress suddenly finds a reason to let her go. Budget cuts, they say, but everyone knows the real reason. They can't be seen employing the wife of an enemy of the people. Natasha finds work eventually at a munitions factory. The work is hard, dirty, and dangerous. She's filling artillery shells with explosives. One mistake, one spark, and you're dead. But they're desperate for workers. The factories are expanding rapidly as the Soviet Union prepares for war, and they're less picky about people's backgrounds. Natasha takes the job. She has no choice. Little Sasha, now 6 years old, doesn't understand what's happened. He knows his father is gone. His mother tells him that Papa had to go away for work, that he'll be back someday. But Sasha senses that something is wrong. The adults around him act strangely. They whisper. They stop talking when he enters a room. At school, some of the other children avoid him. One older boy pushes him and calls his father a traitor. Sasha fights back and gets in trouble. The teacher, who knows about his father, is more lenient than she might otherwise be, but she warns him that fighting is not acceptable Soviet behavior. Vera Petrovna, the old widow, takes pity on Natasha and Sasha. She watches the boy after school while Natasha works her long shifts at the factory. She feeds him occasionally, shares what little she has. It's a risk, helping the family of an arrested man, but Vera is old. She's lived through so much that she's developed a kind of fatalism. What will be? Will be, she thinks. She can't just let a child suffer. Months pass. Natasha hears nothing about Mikhail. She tries to find information. She stands in line at the NKVD headquarters. There's always a line of women there, wives and mothers seeking information about arrested men. After waiting for hours, she reaches a clerk who looks at her with dead eyes and tells her that no information can be provided. If he's guilty, he'll be sentenced. If he's innocent, he'll be released. The organs will decide. That's all she gets. The women in these lines develop a kind of camaraderie. They share information, strategies, rumors. I heard that if you bring money, they might tell you something. I heard that prisoners in Lefortovo can receive packages. I heard that they're sending people to Kazakhstan. It's mostly hearsay, but it's all they have. Anna Akhmatova, the great Russian poet, stood in these lines trying to find out about her arrested son. She later wrote about it in her poem, Requiem. For 17 months I've been crying out, calling you home. I flung myself at the hangman's feet. You are my son and my horror. The experience of these women, the terror, the uncertainty, the helplessness, is captured in that poem. But Requiem couldn't be published in the Soviet Union. It circulated in secret, memorized by those who dared to read it. Meanwhile, where is Mikhail? After his arrest, he was taken to Lubyanka, the NKVD headquarters in Moscow. The building is infamous, a neoclassical structure that houses both offices and prison cells. To be taken to Lubyanka is to enter a nightmare. Mikhail is processed, his belongings are taken, his belt, his shoelaces, anything that could be used for suicide. He's put in a cell with 15 other men, though the cell is designed for maybe 6. They sleep in shifts because there's not enough floor space for everyone to lie down at once. The cell smells of unwashed bodies, of the bucket in the corner that serves as a toilet. The interrogations begin. Mikhail is taken from his cell at odd hours. They deliberately disrupt sleep to disorient prisoners. He's brought to an interrogation room where an NKVD officer sits behind a desk. The officer is young, maybe 30, with cold eyes. You are accused of counter-revolutionary Trotskyite activities, the officer says. Confess, and you will receive a light sentence. Refuse, and it will go worse for you. Mikhail protests, I'm not a Trotskyite, I'm a loyal communist. I've never betrayed the Soviet Union. The officer is unmoved. We have evidence. We have testimony from others. Your denials are pointless. What evidence? Who testified against me? That's not your concern. Sign the confession. Mikhail refuses. He's sent back to his cell. This pattern repeats night after night. The questions are always the same. The pressure is always mounting. Between interrogations, Mikhail has time to think, to worry, to despair. He doesn't sleep. He can't eat. The other prisoners in his cell don't talk to him much. Everyone is trapped in their own nightmare. After a week, the interrogator changes tactics. Now there are 2 of them. One plays the sympathetic friend. Look, we know you're not really a traitor, but someone denounced you and we have to investigate. Just sign the confession saying you were misled by Trotskyite propaganda. You'll get a few years, serve your time, come home. Your wife and son need you, don't be stubborn. The other interrogator is the threat. You're wasting our time. We can make this very unpleasant for you. We can arrest your wife. We can put your son in an orphanage. Is that what you want? Mikkel feels the walls closing in. He's exhausted, terrified, confused, but he still refuses to confess to something he didn't do. He clings to the belief that the truth will come out, that justice will prevail. Then the beatings start. They're systematic, calculated. The interrogators know how to inflict pain without leaving too many visible marks. They beat the soles of his feet with rubber truncheons. They make him stand in a stressed position for hours, arms raised, until his shoulders scream in agony. They deprive him of sleep entirely, keeping him in a brightly lit cell where guards bang on the door if he closes his eyes. After 2 weeks of this, Mikkel breaks. He'll sign anything to make it stop. They put a confession in front of him, typewritten, already prepared. It says that he attended secret meetings of Trotskyites, that he planned to sabotage industrial production, that he intended to assassinate party leaders. None of it is true, but he signs. He signs because he can't take it anymore. Once he signs, the process moves quickly. There's a trial, but it's a formality. 3 judges sit behind a desk. There's no defense attorney. Mikkel is brought in, his confession is read, and he's asked if he confirms it. He nods. What else can he do? Recanting now would only make things worse. The sentence is 10 years in a corrective labor camp. 10 years. Mikkel's knees buckle when he hears it. 10 years is a lifetime. His son will be 15 when he gets out, if he gets out. Many prisoners don't survive 10 years in the gulag. He's taken from Lubyanka to a transit prison, then loaded onto a cattle car with dozens of other prisoners. The journey east begins. They're heading to Kolyma, a region in the far northeast of Siberia, one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth. Kolyma is where the worst camps are located. It's a death sentence, essentially. The guards know it. The prisoners know it. The journey takes weeks. The cattle cars are not heated. Prisoners are given minimal food and water. People die en route from cold, from disease, from despair. The bodies are thrown off at stops along the way. Nobody keeps count. Mikkel survives the journey, but barely. When they arrive at the port city of Magadan, the gateway to Kolyma, he's half-starved, frozen, traumatized. From Magadan, prisoners are distributed to various camps. Mikkel is sent to a gold mining camp deep in the interior. The camp is a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. The barracks are unheated except for a small stove that's never adequate. Prisoners sleep on wooden bunks packed tightly. The blankets are thin. In winter, the temperature inside the barracks drops below freezing. The work is brutal. Prisoners mine gold using hand tools, picks, shovels, wheelbarrows. The work quotas are punishing. If you don't meet your quota, your food ration is reduced. If you don't eat enough, you don't have energy to work. It's a vicious cycle. Many prisoners fall into it and never climb out. They become what other prisoners call goners, living corpses who shuffle through the motions until they drop dead. Mikkel resolves not to become a goner. He works as hard as he can. He scrounges for extra food. He befriends a medic who slips him occasional extra bread. He does whatever it takes to survive. Days blend into weeks, weeks into months. The seasons change, but life in the camp remains the same: work, eat, sleep, repeat. Always cold, always hungry, always exhausted. Some prisoners don't make it. Mikkel watches men die from exposure, from accidents, from disease, from sheer exhaustion. The bodies are buried in mass grave outside the camp. No markers, no ceremonies, they simply disappear. There are moments of humanity even here. Prisoners share what little they have. They tell stories to pass the time. They celebrate birthdays if anyone remembers when their birthday is. They hold on to hope, however fragile. Some believe they'll be released early for good behavior. Others believe there will be an amnesty. Others believe they'll escape. Most know deep down that they'll die here. Mikkel thinks about Natasha and Sasha constantly. It's what keeps him going. He imagines his son growing up, learning to read, starting school. He wonders if Natasha has managed to find work, if she has enough to eat. He writes letters, though he knows they're probably never sent. The camp authorities censor all correspondence heavily, and most prisoner letters are simply discarded, but writing helps him hold on to his humanity. Time passes, years pass. Mikkel's body deteriorates. He develops scurvy from lack of vitamin C, his teeth loosen. His gums bleed. He gets frostbite on his fingers and toes. The tips of 2 fingers on his left hand turn black and fall off. He survives a bout of typhus that kills half the men in his barracks. He's beaten by a guard for not working fast enough. He's put in the punishment cell, an unheated shed where prisoners are left overnight, for talking back to a camp official. He survives that too, though he loses all feeling in his feet afterward. By the time World War II breaks out in 1939, Mikkel has been in the camp for 2 years. He hears about the war through rumors and occasional glimpses of newspapers. The guards talk about it. Some prisoners are released and sent to the front. The army needs men, even ex-prisoners. Mikkel hopes for this, but it doesn't happen. He's considered too politically unreliable, so he stays in Colomar, mining gold while the rest of the country fights for survival. The war years are even harder in the camps. Food becomes scarcer because all resources are going to the front. The death rate spikes. Mikkel survives by sheer stubbornness. He's determined to make it home, to see his family again. In 1943, 6 years after his arrest, there's an amnesty for certain prisoners. Mikkel's name is on the list. He can barely believe it. After so long, he's being released, but the release comes with conditions. He's not allowed to return to Moscow. He's exiled to a small town in Kazakhstan. He must report regularly to the local police. He's not free, not really, but he's out of the camp. The journey from Colomar to Kazakhstan is long. Mikkel travels by ship, by train, by truck. He's weak, malnourished, traumatized, but he's alive. When he finally arrives at the town where he's assigned to live, he finds work at a collective farm. The work is hard, but it's nothing compared to the camp. He has a roof over his head. He gets regular meals, such as they are. He's surviving. He tries to contact Natasha. He sends a letter to their old address in Moscow. Months pass with no reply. He sends another letter, then another. Finally, after nearly a year, he gets a response. But it's not from Natasha. It's from Vera Petrovna, the old widow from their communalka. The letter is short. Vera writes that Natasha died in 1942. She'd been working at the munitions factory when there was an explosion. Several workers were killed. Natasha was one of them. She's buried in a cemetery on the outskirts of Moscow. Sasha is alive. He's 11 now, living in an orphanage. The orphanage is for children of enemies of the people, children whose parents were arrested or died under questionable circumstances. These children are marked, stigmatized. Their opportunities are limited. They're taught to be ashamed of their parents, to denounce them as traitors. Mikkel is devastated. His wife is dead. His son is in an orphanage, being taught to hate him. He thinks about trying to reclaim Sasha, but he knows it's impossible. He's an ex-prisoner exiled with no rights. They'd never let him have custody of his son. He lives out the rest of his life in Kazakhstan, working on the collective farm alone. He drinks too much. He has nightmares. He's a broken man. He survives until 1953, the year Stalin dies. When he hears the news of Stalin's death, he feels nothing, no joy, no relief, just emptiness. His life was destroyed by Stalin's terror, but hating Stalin doesn't bring Natasha back. It doesn't give him back the years he lost. Mikkel dies in 1955 at age 50 from heart failure. He's buried in an unmarked grave in Kazakhstan, far from home, far from his family. His story is one of millions. Millions of people who were caught up in the terror, whose lives were destroyed for no reason, who died alone and forgotten. But wait, what about Sasha? Let's follow his story, because his generation's experience is different from his father's. Sasha represents the children who grew up in the shadow of the terror, who came of age during World War II, who built their lives in the post-Stalin era. When Sasha's father was arrested in 1937, Sasha was 5. When his mother died in 1942, he was 10. He spent his formative years in an orphanage for children of enemies of the people. This was not a kind place. The children were stigmatized, punished for their parents' alleged crimes. They were taught that their parents were traitors who betrayed the motherland. They were told to be grateful that the Soviet state, in its mercy, was giving them a chance to redeem themselves through hard work and loyalty. The orphanage was overcrowded, underfunded, and harsh. The building was a converted school on the outskirts of Moscow, surrounded by a high fence. Inside, 200 children lived in conditions that were barely adequate. They slept in dormitories with rows of narrow metal beds. The food was institutional: watery porridge for breakfast, cabbage soup and bread for lunch, more porridge for dinner. It was enough to keep you alive, but not much more. The staff were overworked and often cruel. Physical punishment was common. If you misbehaved, you might be beaten with a belt or locked in a closet for hours. If you failed to meet your work quota, yes, the children had to work, maintaining the orphanage, growing vegetables in the garden. You might be denied dinner. The philosophy was that these children needed to be reformed, needed to have the taint of their parents' treason beaten out of them. Sasha learned quickly to keep his head down, to follow rules, to not attract attention. He was a quiet child, small for his age, with his father's serious eyes. He rarely smiled. He had learned not to trust adults. They said one thing but meant another. They promised kindness but delivered cruelty. Better to stay silent, to be invisible. But Sasha was also smart. He learned to read easily and devoured whatever books were available in the orphanage's small library. He was good at math. His teachers noticed this, and despite his parentage, they pushed him to study. Education was one of the few paths available for children like him to escape their circumstances. When the war started in 1941, life at the orphanage became even harder. Food became scarcer. Many of the staff were drafted. The older boys, those aged 16 and up, were sent to work in factories or farms to support the war effort. Some lied about their age to join the army. They wanted to fight to prove their loyalty, to redeem their families' names through blood. Sasha was too young for that. He was 10 when the war started, 14 when it ended. He spent those years working in the orphanage's garden, studying when he could, surviving. The war was a distant thunder, news from the front, air raid drills, the occasional bombing when German planes reached Moscow. The orphanage's basement served as a bomb shelter. Sasha remembers huddling there in the dark with the other children, listening to explosions, wondering if this was how he would die. But Moscow held. The Soviet Union, against all odds, pushed back the Germans. By 1945, the war was over. The Soviet Union had won at a cost that was almost incomprehensible. 27 million Soviet citizens died. 27 million, that's more than the entire population of many countries. Every family lost someone. Every village had casualties. The victory was real, but the price was staggering. For Sasha, the end of the war meant a chance to change his life. He was 15, about to age out of the orphanage. He'd done well in school. His teachers recommended him for technical school, a 2-year program that would train him as a machinist. It wasn't university, but it was something. It was a skill, a trade, a future. Sasha threw himself into his studies at technical school. He was driven by a desperate need to prove himself, to escape the stigma of being the son of an enemy of the people. He graduated at the top of his class and got a job at a machine-building plant in Moscow. He was 17 years old, working full-time, earning his own money, living in a worker's dormitory. For the first time in his life, he had a degree of autonomy. The late 1940s and early 1950s were difficult years in the Soviet Union. The country was recovering from the war, but recovery was slow. Food rationing continued until 1947. Housing was desperately short. So many cities had been destroyed, so many buildings bombed. The government prioritized rebuilding industry over building homes. Workers lived in cramped conditions, multiple families to a room, just like before the war. Stalin was still in power, and the terror continued, though not at the same intensity as the 1930s. There was the Doctors' Plot in 1953, where prominent doctors, many of them Jewish, were accused of trying to poison Soviet leaders. It was obviously fabricated, but people were arrested, people disappeared. The atmosphere was tense. Then in March 1953, Stalin died. The news spread through Moscow like wildfire. People's reactions were mixed. Some genuinely grieved. Stalin had led them through the war, made the Soviet Union a superpower. Others felt relief, though they couldn't express it openly. Sasha felt complicated. Stalin had destroyed his family, but Stalin had also built the Soviet Union. How do you reconcile those things? Stalin's death opened up possibilities. There was a brief power struggle, and then Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the leader. Khrushchev was different from Stalin. He was crude, impulsive, but also genuinely committed to reform. In 1956, he gave his secret speech to the Communist Party Congress, denouncing Stalin's crimes, acknowledging the purges, the terror, the cult of personality. The speech was supposed to be secret, for party members only, but word leaked out. People learned about the extent of Stalin's crimes. For many, it was shocking even though they'd suspected. For others, like Sasha, it was a vindication. His father hadn't been a traitor. The arrests, the executions, the camps, they'd been unjust. The party itself was admitting it. Following the secret speech, there was a wave of rehabilitations. People who'd been executed were posthumously declared innocent. People who'd survived the camps were released. Sasha applied to have his father rehabilitated. It took time, bureaucracy moved slowly, but eventually in 1957 he received a letter. Mikhail Antonovich Petrov was officially declared innocent. His conviction was overturned. His name was cleared. But Mikhail was dead. The letter came 10 years too late. Sasha felt a mix of satisfaction and bitterness. His father's name was cleared, but his father never knew it. He died thinking he was a criminal, thinking his son had been taught to hate him. Sasha tried to find out more about his father's fate. He learned that Mikhail had been released from the Gulag in 1943, exiled to Kazakhstan, and died there in 1955. Sasha tried to visit the grave, but he couldn't find it. There were no records, no markers. His father had disappeared into the earth, anonymous. Life went on. Sasha was 25 now, a skilled machinist earning a decent wage. He was eligible for better housing, a room in a communal apartment, not a dormitory. He moved into a communalka in a different part of Moscow. The building was old, the room small, but it was his. He shared the apartment with 5 other families, the usual arrangement. He was starting to build a life. He met a woman named Lyudmila. She worked as a nurse at a local clinic. She was kind, practical, patient. She knew about Sasha's past, the orphanage, his parents, and she didn't judge him for it. They started courting. In the Soviet Union, courting was simple. You went for walks in parks, you went to the cinema, you sat on benches and talked. There wasn't money for fancy dates, but that didn't matter. What mattered was connection, companionship. They got married in 1960. The wedding was simple, a trip to the registry office, signatures on a document, a small celebration with a few friends. No church, no ceremony, just the legal formality. They moved into Sasha's room in the communalka, 2 people in a 10 by 12 foot room. It was cramped, but they made it work. They were in love, that counted for something. Lyudmila got pregnant in 1961. This was both exciting and terrifying. Exciting because they'd have a family, something Sasha had longed for his entire life. Terrifying because where would they put a baby? The room was already too small for 2 people. But you figure it out. You always figure it out. That's what Soviet people did. Their daughter, Natasha, named after Sasha's mother, was born in January 1962. The birth took place in a state hospital, free of charge. The care was adequate if impersonal. Soviet healthcare provided everyone with access to doctors and hospitals, but the system was overworked and undersupplied. Still, Lyudmila and the baby came through fine. That's what mattered. Now there were 3 of them in that tiny room. They bought a crib, stood in line for hours to get it, and squeezed it into the corner. The room was impossibly crowded now, but they managed. Lyudmila stayed home for the first year, caring for Natasha. Money was tight. They lived on Sasha's salary alone, which wasn't much, but they had enough. Just barely, but enough. Life in the early 1960s was better than it had been in the 1940s and 1950s. The economy was growing. Khrushchev had launched a massive housing construction program. New apartment buildings were going up all over Soviet cities, the Khrushchevki named after Khrushchev. They were cheap, prefabricated, poorly built, but they offered something revolutionary: individual apartments for families. No more communal living, your own kitchen, your own bathroom, privacy. Sasha and Lyudmila applied for a Khrushchevka apartment. The waiting list was long, everyone wanted their own place, but they were hopeful. Meanwhile, they made do in their single room, raising Natasha as best they could. The 1960s were also the height of the space race. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. It was a massive propaganda victory for the Soviet Union. The Americans had been beaten. Socialism had triumphed over capitalism. The Soviet people felt proud, felt that their sacrifices had been worth it. Look what we've achieved, we're going to space. Sasha felt that pride too. For the first time in his life, he felt genuinely optimistic about the Soviet Union. Maybe the system did work. Maybe all the suffering had led to something meaningful. His daughter would grow up in a world where the Soviet Union was a superpower, where anything seemed possible. Young Natasha grew up hearing stories about cosmonauts. She'd look up at the night sky and wonder about the stars. Her father would tell her that one day, Soviet people would walk on the moon, would build cities in space. She believed him. Why wouldn't she? The propaganda said so. The teachers at school said so. Everyone said so. In 1964, the family finally got their own apartment, a 2-room Khrushchevka on the outskirts of Moscow. It was tiny, about 45 square meters total, but it was theirs. They had a living room that doubled as a bedroom for Sasha and Lyudmila. They had a small second room for Natasha. They had their own kitchen, barely big enough for 2 people to stand in, but it was their kitchen. They had their own bathroom, cramped but private. They had a small balcony where Lyudmila grew tomatoes in pots. Moving in was like a dream. No more shared kitchen with its arguments and schedules. No more waiting in line for the bathroom. No more neighbors hearing everything through thin walls. They could close their door and be alone. It was luxury. The apartment building was identical to thousands of others going up across the Soviet Union. 5 stories, no elevator, concrete construction, minimal insulation. The apartments were cookie-cutter. Same layout, same fixtures, same everything. But nobody cared. They were just grateful to have their own space. The neighborhood was new, built from scratch on what had been farmland. There were no trees yet, they'd been cleared for construction. The streets were unpaved, turning to mud in spring and fall. But there was a school for Natasha, a clinic where Lyudmila worked, shops for buying groceries. It was a community, and it was theirs. Life settled into a new rhythm. Sasha went to work at the machine plant. Lyudmila worked part-time at the clinic, caring for Natasha when she wasn't working. Natasha started school in 1968, a bright child who loved reading and maths, taking after her father. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable. They had enough. The late 1960s and 1970s are remembered by many Russians as the stagnation years under Leonid Brezhnev, who took over after Khrushchev was ousted in 1964. Brezhnev was conservative, cautious, uncharismatic. The reforms of the Khrushchev era stopped. The economy stagnated. Corruption became endemic, but for ordinary people, life was stable, boring but stable. And after the chaos of the Stalin years, boring wasn't so bad. There was a tacit social contract. You don't challenge the government, and the government provides you with a job, housing, food, education, healthcare. It's not freedom, but it's security. For people like Sasha, who'd experienced the terror and the war, security was valuable. The shortages continued, though. Soviet central planning was inefficient. There were always things you couldn't find in stores. One month it's shoes, another month it's meat, another month it's toilet paper. You learn to adapt. You learn to hoard when you found something useful. You learn to cultivate relationships. Knowing someone who works in a store who can set aside good cuts of meat for you is valuable. The Blatt system, connections, favors, informal exchanges, becomes essential. Sasha and Lyudmila navigate this world competently. Lyudmila's job at the clinic gives her connections to doctors and medical supplies. Sasha's job at the plant gives him access to metal and tools. They trade favors with neighbors. Sasha helps repair someone's broken stove. In return, that neighbor gives them fresh eggs from relatives in the countryside. It's how the system really works beneath the official surface. Natasha grows up in this world. She's a child of the 1960s and 1970s, a generation that doesn't remember the war, doesn't remember the terror. For her, the Soviet Union is just normal. It's all she knows. She joins the young pioneers when she's 7. Every child does. She wears the red neckerchief with pride. She learns the songs, the slogans. She's taught that the Soviet Union is the best country in the world, that capitalism is evil, that the American imperialists want to destroy them. She believes it mostly. Why wouldn't she? But as she gets older, she starts noticing contradictions. The propaganda says the Soviet Union produces everything, but there are always shortages. The propaganda says everyone is equal, but clearly party officials have better apartments, better cars, access to special stores with goods unavailable to regular people. The propaganda says Soviet life is getting better every year, but it doesn't feel like things are improving. Still, she keeps these thoughts to herself. You learn, growing up in the Soviet Union, that there are things you can say and things you can't. You learn to have two faces, the public face that mouths the correct slogans, and the private face that thinks what it really thinks. Natasha does well in school. She's good at math and science. Her teachers encourage her to apply to university. In the Soviet Union, university education is free, but admission is competitive. You have to pass entrance exams. You also need the right background. Children of party members have advantages. Children of workers and peasants are preferred. Children of former enemies of the people. That's complicated. Sasha's father had been rehabilitated, his name cleared. Officially, that should mean Natasha has no issues. But these things have a way of sticking. When she applies to Moscow State University, the most prestigious university in the Soviet Union, there are questions about her grandfather. Why was he arrested? What were the charges? Even though he was innocent, the fact of arrest creates suspicion. Natasha doesn't get into Moscow State. She's devastated. Her grades were good enough. Her exam scores were high, but the right people get in and she's not one of them. Instead, she gets into a technical institute studying engineering. It's a good program, will lead to a good career, but it's not what she dreamed of. She adjusts as people do. The institute is fine. She makes friends. She studies hard. She joins the Komsomol, the Young Communist League, because everyone does. You don't really have a choice. Not joining would mark you as a troublemaker, would limit your opportunities. So you join, you attend the meetings. You vote yes when everyone else votes yes. It's a performance. In her 3rd year, Natasha meets Alexei, a fellow engineering student. He's smart, funny, a bit cynical. They start studying together, which turns into spending time together, which turns into romance. They're careful about where they go, what they say. Alexei's apartment is a communalka, so no privacy there. Natasha's parents' apartment is small, and they're always there, so they meet in parks, in libraries, in quiet corners of the institute. They talk about things you're not supposed to talk about. Alexei has read samizdat, underground literature, books banned by the censors. He has a copy of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn, the novel about the Gulag. It was published briefly during the Khrushchev thaw, but is banned again now. Reading it is risky. Possessing it is risky, but Alexei lends it to Natasha anyway. She reads it in one sitting, hiding in her room, shocked by what she's reading. She knows about the Gulag vaguely. She knows her grandfather was in a camp, but seeing it described so vividly, so honestly, is different. It makes it real. She thinks about her grandfather, about what he must have endured. She feels angry, sad, confused. How did this happen? How did the Soviet Union, which claims to be building a workers' paradise, create a system that destroyed millions of innocent people? She can't talk about these feelings openly, not even with her parents. Her father would be sympathetic, she thinks, but talking about it would dredge up painful memories for him. Her mother is more pragmatic, more willing to accept the official narrative. So Natasha keeps her thoughts to herself, shares them only with Alexei in whispered conversations. They graduate in 1984. Natasha gets a job as an engineer at a design bureau, working on civilian aircraft projects. It's interesting work and she's good at it. Alexei gets a job at a different bureau, also in aviation. They get married in 1985, a simple ceremony like Natasha's parents had. They're assigned a room in a communal apartment. The housing shortage is still severe, and they wait for their own apartment, joining the long queue of young couples hopping for their own space. And then something unexpected happens. In March 1985, a new leader comes to power, Mikhail Gorbachev. He's young 54, which is young for a Soviet leader. He's energetic, charismatic. He talks about reform, about change, about opening up the system. He uses two words that will define his era, glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. At first, people are skeptical. They've heard promises of reform before, but Gorbachev seems serious. He starts releasing political prisoners. He allows more freedom of speech. Newspapers start publishing articles that would have been censored just years before. Articles about corruption, about pollution, about the failures of the system. Television shows debates where people actually disagree. This is shocking to watch. Soviet television has always been bland, propagandistic, boring. Now there are actual arguments, actual criticism. It's exhilarating and frightening at the same time. Archives open up. Historians start publishing documents about Stalin's crimes, about the Gulag, about the collectivization famines. Natasha reads these articles avidly. She learns more about her grandfather, about the scope of the terror, about how many people died. The numbers are staggering. She feels vindicated. She was right to be angry, right to question. But she also feels a kind of vertigo. Everything she was taught growing up is being called into question. The late 1980s are a time of chaos and excitement. New political movements emerge. People are forming independent groups, demanding democracy, demanding freedom. The Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, start pushing for independence. Other republics follow. The Soviet Union, this monolithic empire, is starting to fracture. Economically, things are getting worse. Gorbachev's reforms aren't working as planned. The economy is in crisis. Shortages intensify. Lines for food get longer. There's a joke that circulates. What has perestroika given us? Empty shelves and freedom of speech to complain about them. Natasha and Alexei's lives are affected by all this. Alexei's design bureau is running out of funding. Projects are being cancelled. There's talk of layoffs. In the Soviet Union, where everyone has always had guaranteed employment, the idea of unemployment is terrifying. What do you do if you don't have a job? How do you survive? Meanwhile, their daughter, yes, they had a daughter in 1986, named Olga, is growing up in a very different Soviet Union than Natasha did. Little Olga will have almost no memory of the old system. By the time she's old enough to understand the world, the Soviet Union will be gone. In 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. Natasha and Alexei watch it on television, stunned. The wall had stood for 28 years, a symbol of the Cold War, of the division of Europe. And now people are tearing it down with hammers and their bare hands. The Soviet Union doesn't intervene. Gorbachev lets it happen. The Eastern European countries, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany, they all break free from Soviet control. The empire that Stalin built is collapsing. And within the Soviet Union itself, the republics are declaring sovereignty, demanding independence. In August 1991, hardliners in the Communist Party try a coup. They want to stop Gorbachev's reforms, restore the old order. They send tanks into Moscow, but the coup fails. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, rallies opposition. He stands on a tank and defies the coup plotters. Ordinary Muscovites come out to support him. The coup collapses after 3 days. Natasha and Alexei watch all this from their apartment, now their own one-bedroom flat that they finally got assigned in 1989. They watch on television as history unfolds. They're scared. What's going to happen? Is there going to be civil war? But they're also hopeful. Maybe real change is finally coming. By December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolves. The 15 republics become independent countries. The red flag comes down from the Kremlin for the last time. The Russian tricolor goes up in its place. After 74 years, the Soviet Union is no more. For Natasha and Alexei, the immediate aftermath is chaos. The economy collapses. Hyperinflation wipes out their savings overnight. Alexei's design bureau shuts down entirely. He's unemployed for the first time in his life. Natasha's bureau is privatized, bought by a businessman who fires half the staff. She keeps her job barely. The 1990s in Russia are brutal. The state safety net disappears. Pensions aren't paid. Salaries aren't paid. Crime explodes. The mafia takes over whole sectors of the economy. Life expectancy drops. It's a catastrophe. Many people, especially older people, are nostalgic for the Soviet Union. Life was hard, but it was stable. You had a job, you had food, you had security. Now it's chaos. People are selling their possessions on the street just to buy food. Natasha's parents, Sasha and Lyudmila, both in their 60s now, are struggling. Their pensions are worthless. Natasha helps them as much as she can, but she can barely support her own family. Alexei eventually finds work, a series of odd jobs, driving a taxi, working security, whatever he can get. It's humiliating for him. He was an engineer, a professional. Now he's scrambling for whatever work he can find. The indignity of it eats at him. Olga, their daughter, is 5 years old when the Soviet Union collapses. She'll grow up in the new Russia, a very different country. She'll learn about the Soviet Union in history class, but it will be abstract to her, something that happened long ago. She won't remember standing in lines. She won't remember the shortages, the propaganda, the fear. She'll grow up with the internet, with McDonald's, with all the Western consumer goods that flood into Russia in the 1990s and 2000s. For her parents' generation, for Natasha and Alexei, the transition is traumatic. They've lost the world they knew. The certainties they grew up with are gone. The future is uncertain. But they adapt as people do. They survive. They rebuild their lives in the new Russia. Looking back now from the perspective of the 2020s, how do people remember the Soviet Union? It's complicated. For some, especially those who suffered under it, the children of the purge, the survivors of the Gulag, the dissidents, it's a nightmare they're glad is over. For others, especially those who came of age in the 1960s and 1970s during the relatively stable Brezhnev years, there's nostalgia. Life was simpler then, more predictable, less stressful in some ways. The truth, as always, is complex. The Soviet Union achieved remarkable things: industrialization, space exploration, victory in World War II, universal literacy and education, a certain kind of social equality. But it also committed horrific crimes: the purges, the Gulag, the collectivization, famines, the suppression of freedom, the creation of a police state where people lived in fear. Sasha, Natasha's father, dies in 2008 at age 76. He lived long enough to see the Soviet Union rise and fall. He lived through the terror, the war, the stagnation, the collapse, and the chaotic rebirth of Russia. On his deathbed, Natasha asks him if he thinks it was all worth it, all the suffering, all the sacrifice. He thinks for a long time before answering. "I don't know," he finally says. "We built something. We defeated the Nazis. We went to space, but we also destroyed so many lives. My father, your grandmother, millions of others. Was it worth it? I honestly don't know." That ambiguity, that uncertainty, is perhaps the truest legacy of the Soviet Union. It wasn't simply evil, and it wasn't simply good. It was a massive human experiment that produced both remarkable achievements and terrible crimes. And the people who lived through it, they were just trying to survive, to find moments of happiness, to build lives for themselves and their families. Now, before we continue deeper into specific aspects of Soviet life, I want to remind you that if you're finding this journey through history fascinating, please hit that like button and leave a comment below. What aspect of Soviet life are you finding most interesting? Do you have family members who lived through this era? Share your stories. We read every comment. And don't forget to subscribe to Dreamless Timelines for more historical deep dives that are perfect for relaxing or falling asleep to. Your support means everything to us. Let's talk about something we haven't explored in depth yet: daily life in the Soviet countryside. Because while we've focused on urban life, on Moscow and other cities, the majority of Soviet citizens lived in rural areas, at least until the mid-20th century. And life in the countryside was very different from life in the city. Imagine a village in central Russia in the 1950s. Let's call it Nikolskoye, though it could be any of tens of thousands of similar villages scattered across the Soviet Union. The village has maybe 200 people, 40 or 50 households. The houses are traditional wooden structures, izbas, with peaked roofs and small windows. They're heated by large brick stoves that serve as both furnace and cooking range. The village is part of a collective farm, a kolkhoz. Everyone in the village works on the kolkhoz, except for the very old and the very young. The kolkhoz grows grain, potatoes, and vegetables. There's also a dairy herd and some pigs. The work is seasonal. Spring is for planting. Summer is for weeding and tending. Fall is for harvest. Winter is for repair work and rest. Life revolves around the agricultural calendar. When it's planting season, everyone works from dawn to dusk. When it's harvest time, the pressure is intense. You have a narrow window to get the crops in before the weather turns. Everyone pitches in, even children. It's exhausting, back-breaking work. The kolkhoz is run by a chairman, appointed by the district party committee. The chairman is supposed to manage production, meet the quotas assigned by the central planners, distribute work among the collective farm members. It's a difficult job. The quotas are often unrealistic. The machinery is often broken. The workers are often unmotivated because the pay is low and the work is hard. Collective farm workers, kolkhozniki, are paid in labor days. A labor day isn't an actual day of work, it's a unit of accounting. Different tasks are worth different numbers of labor days. Plowing a field might be worth 2 labor days. Milking cows might be worth 1. At the end of the year, after the harvest is sold and the farm's expenses are paid, the remaining money is divided among the workers based on how many labor days they accumulated. The problem is that collective farms often don't make much money. After the state takes its share, the obligatory grain deliveries, the taxes, there's not much left. So kolkhozniki often receive very little cash income. They supplement by working their private plots. Each household on a collective farm is allowed a small private plot, usually about half an acre, where they can grow vegetables, keep a cow or some chickens, produce food for their own consumption or to sell at the market. These private plots are incredibly important. They provide much of the food that rural families eat. They also provide a small cash income from selling surplus at the local market. Let me introduce you to a family in Nikolskoye, the Sokolov family. Ivan Sokolov is 50 years old in 1955, a war veteran who lost his left arm at the Battle of Kursk in 1943. He came back to the village after the war and resumed his life as a collective farm worker. His wife Anna is 47. They have 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. The oldest son, Pyotr, is 25 and already has his own family. The other 3 children still live at home. The Sokolov's izba is typical for the village. It has 2 rooms, a main room that serves as kitchen, dining room and living room, and a smaller room where the family sleeps. The sleeping arrangements are tight. Ivan and Anna have a bed. The children sleep on benches that double as beds or on top of the big stove, which stays warm all night. The house has no running water. Water comes from a well in the center of the village. Anna or one of the daughters makes several trips a day, carrying buckets. In winter, this is brutal. The temperature drops to -20, -30. The water freezes quickly. You have to be fast. There's no electricity in Nikolskoye until 1958. Until then, light comes from kerosene lamps. Nights are dark, punctuated only by the small circles of lamplight. People go to bed early because there's not much to do after dark. They wake at dawn because that's when work begins. The outhouse is a small wooden structure behind the house, a simple pit toilet. In winter, using it is an ordeal. You bundle up, trudge through the snow, do your business as quickly as possible, and rush back inside. It's not pleasant, but it's life. Bathing happens in the banya, the bathhouse. Most villages have a communal banya, a small building with a wood-fired stove that heats rocks. You pour water on the hot rocks to create steam. You sit in the steam, sweating, whipping yourself with birch branches to increase circulation. Then you rinse with cold water or in winter, roll in the snow. It's intense, but it's also a social event. The men go to the banya on one day, the women on another. People talk, relax, escape from the cold and the dirt of daily life. Food in the countryside is basic but usually adequate. The Sokolovs grow most of what they eat on their private plot. Potatoes are the staple, boiled, fried, mashed, made into pancakes. They eat potatoes with every meal. They also grow cabbage, carrots, beets, onions. In summer, there are fresh vegetables. In winter, they eat preserved vegetables, sauerkraut, pickles, root vegetables stored in a cellar beneath the house. They have a cow that provides milk. Anna makes butter and sour cream. They have chickens that provide eggs. They slaughter a pig once a year, usually in late fall. The pork is salted and smoked to preserve it. Fresh meat is a rare treat. Most meals are meatless: vegetable soup, porridge, bread. Bread is sacred in Russian culture. Wasting bread is considered sinful. The Sokolovs bake their own bread using flour they get from the kolkhoz or buy at the village shop. The bread is dark, heavy, filling. It's the foundation of every meal. Life in Nikolskoye is hard, but there are moments of joy. Holidays are celebrated enthusiastically. New Year's is the biggest holiday. There's a feast, if possible, with special foods saved for the occasion. There's music, dancing, vodka. People visit each other's houses, exchange small gifts. For a few days, the drudgery of daily life is forgotten. May Day, International Workers' Day, is another big holiday. The village has a celebration with speeches by the kolkhoz chairman and local party officials. There's a parade of sorts with people carrying red flags and banners. The children perform songs and dances. It's propaganda, but it's also a break from routine, a chance to gather as a community. Religious holidays are complicated. Officially, the Soviet Union is atheist. Religion is discouraged, sometimes suppressed. Churches have been closed or converted to other uses. Priests have been arrested, but in the countryside, old traditions die hard. Many people, especially the older generation, still believe. They still observe Easter, still observe Christmas, though they do it quietly, privately, without drawing attention. Anna Sokolova crosses herself when she thinks no one is watching. She keeps an icon hidden in a drawer. On Easter, she bakes kulik, the traditional Easter bread, and decorates eggs. She doesn't go to church. The nearest functioning church is 30 kilometers away, but she observes the holiday in her own way. Her children have been taught atheism in school, but she hopes that somehow, some thread of faith will survive. The village has a school, a simple one-room building where children of all ages are taught together by a single teacher. The curriculum is basic: reading, writing, arithmetic, Soviet history, geography. The children learn to read using primers that teach the alphabet alongside communist slogans. A is for Armia, the Red Army defends us. B is for Bolshevik, the party that leads us. Education is valued, even in rural areas. It's seen as a path to a better life. If a child does well in school, they might be able to go to the district high school, maybe even to technical school or university. This means leaving the village, moving to a town or city. For parents, it's bittersweet. They want their children to have opportunities, but it also means losing them. The Sokolov's youngest son, Nikolai, is smart. His teacher says he should continue his education, but this creates tension. The kolkhoz needs workers. If all the smart young people leave, who will work the fields? The chairman tries to discourage families from sending children away to school. But Ivan and Anna want better for Nikolai than a life of backbreaking farm labor. They let him go to the district high school in 1957. Nikolai lives with relatives in the district town during the school year, comes home for summers and holidays. He does well. He's eventually accepted to a technical institute, studying to become an agronomist. He'll return to rural life, but as a specialist, an expert, not a manual laborer. This is social mobility, Soviet style. You can rise through education, through proving yourself, through serving the system. But many young people who leave the village never come back. They find jobs in cities. They marry city people. They build lives elsewhere. This creates a slow drain of youth from rural areas. Villages age. The old outnumber the young. Fields go untended. It's a problem that will worsen over the decades. Life in Nikolskoye changes slowly through the late 1950s and 1960s. Electricity arrives in 1958. Suddenly, homes have electric lights. It's transformative. Evenings are no longer dark. People can read, do work, socialize after sunset. A few years later, some families get televisions. The village gathers to watch. The Sokolovs are one of the first families to get a TV, and neighbors come over to watch programs. The TV brings the outside world into the village. Broadcasts from Moscow, news, entertainment, propaganda. The kolkhoz gets better machinery. New tractors arrive, replacing the old ones that broke down constantly. There's a combine harvester now, which makes the grain harvest faster and less labor-intensive. The work is still hard, but it's getting easier slowly. The standard of living rises incrementally. By the 1970s, many families have refrigerators. Some have washing machines. The village gets a paved road connecting it to the district town, replacing the dirt track that became impassable in spring and fall. A bus runs twice a day, making it easier to get to town, to access services, to sell produce at the market. But the fundamental structure of life doesn't change much. People still work on the kolkhoz. They still tend their private plots. They still live in wooden houses, though some families build new homes with better materials. The rhythms of agricultural life continue, planting, growing, harvesting, year after year, generation after generation. Ivan Sokolov dies in 1972 at age 67, his body worn out from decades of hard labor and the lingering effects of his war injury. Anna lives on, alone now in their izba, tending her garden, keeping chickens. Her children visit when they can, but they have their own lives now. Pyotr runs the kolkhoz. He became chairman after the old chairman retired. Nikolai is an agronomist at a different kolkhoz in another district. The daughters married and moved away. Anna dies in 1980. The izba passes to Pyotr, who doesn't need it. He has his own house, but keeps it as a summer dacha, a place to escape the village center to grow vegetables. This pattern repeats across rural Russia. The old generation dies off. The houses stand empty or are used seasonally. The villages shrink. By the time the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, rural Russia is in crisis. The collective farms are failing. Without state support, without guaranteed prices for grain, many farms are barely functional. Young people flee to cities looking for better opportunities. Villages die. Some are abandoned entirely, becoming ghost towns. But let's step back from Nikolskoye and talk about other aspects of Soviet rural life. Let's talk about the differences between regions. Because the Soviet Union was vast, spanning 11 time zones, encompassing dozens of ethnic groups, covering climates from Arctic tundra to Central Asian deserts, and rural life varied enormously. In Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, collective farms tended to be more prosperous. The black earth soil was fertile, the climate was milder, farms grew wheat, corn, sunflowers, villages were larger, more prosperous. But Ukraine also bore the scars of the collectivization famine. Every village had lost people. Every family had memories of the Holodomor. These memories were suppressed officially, but they persisted in private, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren. In Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, rural life was different again. The nomadic traditions had been destroyed by forced collectivization and settlement. The Kazakhs, who had roamed the steppes with their herds for centuries, were forced onto collective farms. Cotton became the dominant crop in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. grown at the expense of food crops, leading to dependency on grain imports from other parts of the Soviet Union. The Aral Sea, once the world's fourth largest lake, began to shrink in the 1960s because rivers feeding it were diverted for cotton irrigation. By the 1980s, it had lost more than half its volume. Fishing villages became desert towns, their ports now dozens of kilometers from water. This ecological disaster was a direct result of Soviet central planning, prioritizing cotton production over environmental sustainability. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which were forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940, rural life retained some distinctiveness. The farms were more efficient, more productive. The farmers were more resentful of Soviet rule. These were countries that had been independent between the wars, that had experienced different systems. They never fully accepted Soviet rule. Nationalist sentiment remained strong, kept alive in private, waiting for an opportunity to re-emerge. In Siberia and the Far East, rural life often meant living in isolation. Villages separated by hundreds of kilometers. No roads, only rivers, and in winter, ice roads. People living traditional ways, hunting, fishing, herding reindeer alongside Soviet modernity. Indigenous peoples, the Saka, the Evenki, the Nenets, dozens of others, forced to adapt to Soviet ways, their languages suppressed, their children sent to boarding schools to be educated as Soviet citizens. The Soviet Union claimed to be a federation of equal republics, but in reality, it was Russian-dominated. Russian was the language of power, of advancement. If you wanted to get ahead, you learned Russian. The non-Russian republics had their own languages, cultures, traditions, but they existed within a framework defined by Moscow. This tension between Russian center and non-Russian periphery would ultimately contribute to the Soviet Union's collapse, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to the daily texture of life, this time looking at work in the Soviet Union. Work in the Soviet Union was fundamentally different from work in capitalist countries. Everyone had the right to work. It was guaranteed by the constitution. Unemployment was essentially non-existent, but this created its own problems. Because everyone had a guaranteed job, there was no real pressure to work efficiently. The saying, "they pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work," captured a truth about Soviet labor. Wages were low and fairly equal. A doctor might earn only slightly more than a factory worker. There wasn't much incentive to work harder or better. You got paid the same either way. This led to chronic inefficiency. Workers would show up, go through the motions, do the minimum necessary. Factories would produce goods that met quotas on paper, but were of poor quality in reality. Shops would stock shelves with items that no one wanted to buy. The entire system ran on inertia and coercion rather than incentive. But let's look at what work actually felt like for different people. Let's start with factory work. Imagine you're working at a tractor factory in Stalingrad in the 1960s. You're part of an assembly line, one of thousands of workers putting together tractors that will be shipped to collective farms across the Soviet Union. The factory is huge, cavernous. High ceilings, poor lighting, deafening noise. The clang of metal, the hiss of welding torches, the rumble of machinery. You work an 8-hour shift, though in reality, there's a lot of standing around. Materials don't arrive on time. The machinery breaks down. Your supervisor doesn't really care as long as the production quota is met at the end of the month. The quota is everything. The factory has to produce a certain number of tractors per month to meet the plan. As the end of the month approaches, there's a frantic push, the SH term, they call it the storm. Everyone works overtime, rushing to complete tractors, cutting corners, ignoring quality standards. The tractors get counted, the quota is met, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief. Never mind that half the tractors will break down within a year. That's not your problem, that's the farm's problem. Safety standards are lax. Accidents happen. People lose fingers in machinery. Toxic fumes from welding and painting cause health problems, but there's not much recourse. You file a report, maybe get some compensation, go back to work. What choice do you have? On the plus side, the job is stable. You can't be fired easily. Even if you're incompetent, even if you're lazy, you'll probably keep your job. The factory provides benefits, a cafeteria with cheap meals, a clinic for medical care, sometimes housing. There are social activities, a factory club where workers can play chess, watch films, attend lectures. May Day and Revolution Day are celebrated with parades and bonuses. The trade union is supposed to represent workers, but it's basically an arm of management. It organizes the social activities, distributes perks like vouchers for vacations at sanatoriums, but it doesn't really advocate for workers. Strikes are illegal. Genuine labor organizing is impossible. The official line is that workers own the means of production through the state, so there's no conflict between labor and management. In reality, there's plenty of conflict, but it's suppressed. Now let's look at a different kind of work. Let's talk about being a doctor in the Soviet Union. Healthcare was free and universal, one of the Soviet Union's genuine achievements. Everyone had access to doctors, hospitals, medications, but the system was underfunded, overburdened, and bureaucratic. Imagine you're Dr. Irina Mikhailovna working at a polyclinic, a neighborhood health center in Moscow in the 1970s. You're a general practitioner, seeing dozens of patients a day. The polyclinic is crowded, always crowded. People wait for hours to see a doctor. Your appointment slots are supposed to be 15 minutes each, but with the volume of patients, you're lucky if you get 10 minutes per person. The facilities are adequate but not great. The building is old, in need of repair. The examination rooms are small, cramped. The equipment is outdated. You have the basics: stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, thermometer, but modern diagnostic equipment is scarce. If you need to order an X-ray or lab work, the patient might wait weeks for an appointment. Medications are often in short supply. You write prescriptions, but there's no guarantee the pharmacy will have the drugs. Patients come back saying they couldn't get their medication, and you have to prescribe an alternative if there is one. Your salary is low. Doctors are respected but not well paid. You make about the same as a skilled factory worker. You became a doctor because you wanted to help people, not because you expected to get rich, but it's frustrating. You went through years of medical school and you're barely making ends meet. There are ways to supplement your income. Patients often bring gifts: a bottle of cognac, a box of chocolates, sometimes money in an envelope. This is blat in action. You're not supposed to accept it, but everyone does. It's understood. If you want better care, faster service, a specialist referral, you bring a gift. It's not exactly bribery, it's more like a social custom, but it's also a reflection of how the system really works. Despite the frustrations, there's satisfaction in the work. You help people. You diagnose illnesses, treat injuries, deliver Barbies, comfort the dying. It's meaningful work. And unlike in capitalist countries, you're not worried about whether patients can afford care. Everyone gets treated, regardless of their ability to pay. That's something. Let's look at another profession: teaching. Soviet teachers were respected but also underpaid. Imagine you're a teacher at a secondary school in Leningrad in the 1960s. You teach history, which is a politically sensitive subject. The curriculum is set by the Ministry of Education. You follow it closely. You teach the approved narrative: the heroic revolution, the wise leadership of Lenin and Stalin, the triumph of socialism over capitalism, the Great Patriotic War. You can't deviate from this narrative. To question it, to offer alternative interpretations would be dangerous. So you don't. You teach what you're told to teach. You give your students the information they need to pass their exams, to repeat the correct answers. But in private, you're more nuanced. When students ask probing questions, and the smart ones always do, you answer carefully. You might say, "That's an interesting question, but it's beyond the scope of our curriculum," which is a way of saying, "Yes, there's more to the story, but I can't tell you here." The smart students understand. Your classroom is crowded. 35 students, all in uniforms, boys in dark trousers and white shirts, girls in brown dresses with white aprons. They're respectful mostly. Discipline is strict. You have authority, but engaging them is a challenge. The subject matter is often dry, ideological. You try to bring it to life with stories, with connections to their lives, but you're constrained by what you're allowed to say. You grade papers in the evenings, sitting at your kitchen table under a dim lamp. The pay is modest. Like the doctor, you earn about as much as a factory worker. But you have summers off, which is a significant perk. You use that time to rest, to read, to travel if you can afford it. There's a sense of purpose to teaching. You're shaping young minds, preparing the next generation of Soviet citizens. You take that seriously. Even if you're cynical about the propaganda you're required to teach, you believe in the value of education itself. Now let's talk about a very different kind of work: being a scientist in the Soviet Union. Soviet science had a complicated relationship with the state. On one hand, the Soviet Union invested heavily in science and technology. The space program, nuclear weapons, mathematics, physics, these were all priorities. Scientists in these fields were well funded, well respected, sometimes even wealthy by Soviet standards. On the other hand, science was subject to ideological control. Certain fields were deemed incompatible with Marxist-Leninism. Genetics, for example, was suppressed under Stalin because it contradicted Lysenko's crackpot theories that Stalin endorsed. Cybernetics was initially condemned as a bourgeois pseudoscience. Researchers who challenged the party line could be purged, imprisoned, killed. Imagine you're a physicist working at a research institute in Novosibirsk in the 1970s. Novosibirsk in Siberia was home to Akademgorodok, academic town, a special city built for scientists and researchers. It was relatively liberal by Soviet standards, a place where ideas could be discussed more freely. Your work is theoretical physics. You have access to good facilities, competent colleagues, interesting problems. The state funds your research generously because physics is important for the military, for nuclear weapons, for strategic competition with the West. You publish papers, attend conferences, contribute to the advancement of knowledge. But there are frustrations. You can't travel abroad easily. You need special permission, which is granted sparingly and only to those deemed politically reliable. You read about research being done in the West, and you wish you could collaborate, could attend international conferences, could exchange ideas freely. But that's not how the system works. You're also aware that some of your colleagues are informers. The KGB, successor to the NKVD, monitors scientific institutions, looking for dissent, for contact with foreigners, for anything suspicious. You watch what you say. You don't discuss politics. You focus on your work. Despite the restrictions, Soviet science achieved remarkable things. The space program is the most visible example. In 1957, Sputnik. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin. In 1965, the first spacewalk. In 1970, the first unmanned lunar rover. These were genuine achievements, proof that the Soviet system could produce cutting-edge technology. But the system also had fundamental problems. The centralization stifled innovation. The bureaucracy was stifling. Resources were allocated based on political priorities rather than scientific merit. There was a brain drain. Scientists emigrated when they could, seeking better opportunities in the West. Let's shift gears and talk about a completely different aspect of Soviet life: culture and entertainment. Because despite all the repression and hardship, Soviet people found ways to entertain themselves, to create art, to have fun. Soviet cinema produced some genuinely great films. Directors like Sergei Eisenstein, Andrei Tarkovsky, Elim Klimov created art that transcended propaganda. Yes, there was a lot of socialist realist schlock, films about heroic workers and wise party leaders, but there was also real artistry. Going to the cinema was a popular activity. Tickets were cheap. The theaters were often ornate, holdovers from the pre-revolutionary era or Stalinist constructions meant to showcase the glory of socialism. People would line up for popular films. Soviet audiences loved comedies, musicals, war films, anything that offered escape from daily drudgery. Western films were rarely shown, and when they were carefully selected. Chaplin was okay because he was critical of capitalism. Italian neorealism was acceptable. Hollywood blockbusters, forget it, those were seen as decadent, corrupting influences. But people found ways to see forbidden films. In the later Soviet period, VCRs became available, and bootleg tapes of Western movies circulated. People would gather at someone's apartment to watch a grainy copy of a Hollywood film, feeling slightly transgressive, enjoying the forbidden fruit. Literature was huge in Soviet culture. Russians have always been passionate readers, and that continued under Soviet rule. The state published books cheaply. Libraries were everywhere. People read voraciously, classics, contemporary Soviet literature, whatever they could get their hands on. But good contemporary literature was often banned or heavily censored. Authors like Boris Pasternak, whose Dr. Zhivago was published abroad but not in the Soviet Union. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose exposés of the Gulag system got him exiled. Joseph Brodsky, the poet, sent to internal exile and later forced to emigrate. These banned works circulated in samizdat, self-published, typewritten copies passed from hand to hand. Owning samizdat was risky. If the KGB found it during a search, you could be arrested. But people took the risk because they were hungry for truth, for literature that spoke honestly about life. Music was another outlet. Soviet composers like Shostakovich and Prokofiev created masterpieces, often walking a tightrope between artistic integrity and political acceptability. Shostakovich's music, in particular, contained layers of meaning, subtle critiques encoded in the notes, understood by those who knew how to listen. Popular music was more complicated. Rock and roll was officially frowned upon as a Western corruption, but young people loved it. They listened to Voice of America radio broadcasts, recorded songs onto whatever they could find, sometimes even X-ray films, creating what they called bone records, or ribs. Bands formed, playing in basements and apartments, away from official scrutiny. By the 1970s and 1980s, Soviet rock had developed its own identity. Bands like Aquarium, Kino, and DDT created music that spoke to Soviet youth, expressing frustrations and dreams that couldn't be articulated in official channels. The authorities tolerated this up to a point, as long as it didn't become overtly political. Sports were a huge part of Soviet culture. The state invested heavily in athletics, seeing it as a way to demonstrate the superiority of socialism. Soviet athletes dominated Olympic sports, gymnastics, weightlifting, wrestling, hockey. The USSR versus USA hockey games were proxy Cold War battles, watched by millions. For ordinary people, sports were a way to stay healthy, to compete, to have something to root for. Football was the most popular sport. Every factory, every neighborhood had a team. Games were well attended, passionate affairs. Hockey was huge too, especially after the Soviet national team started beating the Canadians. Leisure time was limited, but people made use of what they had. In cities, people walked. Walking was a major form of recreation. You'd stroll along boulevards, through parks, people watching, window shopping. In summer, you'd go to the park to escape the heat, to sit by a fountain, to eat ice cream. Dachas were a huge part of Soviet leisure culture. A dacha is a country house, usually a small wooden structure on a plot of land outside the city. In the Soviet era, many families had access to dachas. Either they owned one, or they rented one, or they had use of one through their workplace. In summer, families would decamp to the dacha. The parents would commute to work from there, or they'd use vacation time to stay for extended periods. Kids would spend the whole summer at the dacha, running wild, swimming in lakes, picking berries. It was freedom, escape from the crowded city apartments. At the dacha, you'd grow vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers, potatoes, berries. This wasn't just recreation, it was necessary. The produce from your dacha plot supplemented your diet, reduced your dependence on the unreliable supply in state stores. People took their gardening seriously. The dacha was a place of both relaxation and hard work. Now, if you're still following along on this journey through Soviet history, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a second to hit that like button. It helps more people discover these deep dives into history. And leave a comment, tell us what you think, share your own family stories if you have connections to this era. We love hearing from you. And of course, subscribe to Dreamless Timelines for more content like this. Your support keeps us going. Let's talk about something we haven't covered in depth, the role of women in Soviet society. The Soviet Union was, in some ways, progressive on women's rights. In other ways, it was deeply patriarchal. The Bolsheviks early on promoted women's equality. Women got the vote in 1917, before women in many Western countries. Divorce was made easy. Abortion was legalized in 1920, though it would be banned again in 1936 and re-legalized in 1955. Women were encouraged to work, to pursue careers, to be economically independent. This was radical for its time, but the reality was complicated. Yes, women worked. By the 1970s, something like 90% of working-age women were employed, but they also bore the double burden. They worked full-time jobs and then came home to do all the housework and childcare. Soviet men, by and large, did not share domestic labor. It was women who cooked, cleaned, shopped, cared for children. Shopping in particular was exhausting. Remember those lines we talked about? Women spent hours every day standing in lines, trying to secure food and household goods. After working an 8-hour shift, they'd rush to the store, wait in line for an hour to buy bread, wait in another line for meat if there was any, wait in another line for milk, then home to cook dinner, help kids with homework, do laundry, clean. It was relentless. Soviet propaganda celebrated women as strong, capable, equal to men. Posters showed female workers, female soldiers, female scientists. And these weren't entirely lies. Women did work in all these fields. But the highest positions were still dominated by men. The Politburo, the top decision-making body, was always overwhelmingly male. Factory managers, government ministers, top scientists, mostly men. Still, women had opportunities that their grandmothers couldn't have imagined. They could be doctors, engineers, professors. Education was open to them. A woman from a peasant background could, through education and hard work, become a professional. That was real social mobility. During World War II, women played crucial roles. With so many men at the front, women took over their jobs. They worked in factories making weapons. They drove trucks and tractors. Some even fought. There were female snipers, pilots, tank crews. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the Soviet sniper, had 309 confirmed kills. The Night Witches were female bomber pilots who flew harassment missions against the Germans. After the war, women were expected to return to more traditional roles, but the experience of wartime independence couldn't be erased. Women had proven they could do anything men could do. This created tension between official ideology, women are equal, and social reality, but they should still do all the housework. Childcare was a challenge. The state provided nurseries and kindergartens, which allowed women to work. Leaving your baby at a state nursery at 3 months old so you could return to work was common. The care was adequate but impersonal. Many women felt guilty about it, but there wasn't much choice. You needed 2 incomes to survive. Maternity leave was provided. Women got time off after giving birth, with job protection. This was progressive for the time, but the leave wasn't long enough and there was pressure to return to work quickly. Your workplace needed you. The plan needed to be fulfilled. Let's follow the life of a Soviet woman through different stages. Meet Galina. She's born in 1945, right at the end of World War II. Her father died in the war. Her mother raises her alone, working in a textile factory, struggling to make ends meet. Galina goes to school, does well. She's encouraged to pursue higher education. She goes to a pedagogical institute, studies to become a teacher. She graduates in 1966, starts teaching at a school in her hometown, a mid-sized industrial city in the Urals. She meets Sergei, an engineer at a local factory. They date for a year, then marry in 1968. They get a room in a communalka, start their life together. Galina keeps teaching. Sergei works at the factory. They save money, hopping for their own apartment. Galina gets pregnant in 1970. She works until her 8th month, then takes maternity leave. Their daughter, Olga, is born in March 1971. Galina has 3 months of leave, then she's back at work. Olga goes to a state nursery. Dropping off her 3-month-old baby at the nursery is heartbreaking for Galina. She cries on the way to work, but she has no choice. They need her salary, and this is normal. Every woman does it. You push down your feelings and do what's necessary. Galina's days become a marathon. Up at 6, feed Olga, drop her at the nursery by 7. Work until 3, teachers get shorter hours than most workers. Pick up Olga, stop at stores on the way home waiting in lines. Home by 5, cook dinner, feed Olga, clean up, bathe Olga, put her to bed, do laundry, ironing, whatever needs doing. Prepare lessons for tomorrow's classes, fall into bed exhausted. Sergei helps a little. He'll watch Olga sometimes while Galina cooks. He'll take out the trash, but the bulk of the domestic labor falls on Galina. This is just how it is. Soviet men don't do housework. It's not expected of them. When Olga is 3, Galina gets pregnant again. They can barely manage with 1 child in their single room. How will they manage with 2? But abortion, while legal again, is stigmatized. And Galina wants another child, wants Olga to have a sibling. So they proceed. Their son, Dmitry, is born in 1974. Now there are 4 people in 1 room. It's impossible, but they get lucky. They're finally assigned a 2-bedroom apartment in a new Khrushchevka building. It's small, but it's their own space. The relief is enormous. Galina's life continues in this vein for years. Work, children, housework, repeat. She loves her children, loves teaching, but she's always tired, always stressed. There's never enough time, never enough money, never enough of anything. She looks at her mother's life, so much harder. A widow raising a child alone in the aftermath of war, and thinks she has it easier. And she does. She has a husband, a job, an apartment. She's not starving. Her children are healthy. This is success by Soviet standards. But she also wonders, sometimes, what life might have been like if things were different. If she had more help at home. If she didn't have to spend hours in lines. If she had more choices, more freedom. These thoughts are dangerous, unpatriotic. She keeps them to herself. This is the reality for millions of Soviet women. They're told they're equal, they're liberated. And in some ways they are. But they're also exhausted, overburdened, caught between competing demands. They make it work because they have to, because that's what Soviet women do. Let's talk about old age in the Soviet Union. What was it like to be elderly in a system that glorified youth and productivity? The Soviet state provided pensions for retirees. The pension system was universal. Everyone who worked was entitled to a pension in old age. This was a significant social achievement. In many countries, even today, elderly people without savings face poverty. In the Soviet Union, there was a safety net. But the pensions were small, often barely enough to live on. And with inflation, even though official Soviet statistics denied it existed, the purchasing power of pensions declined over time. Elderly people often relied on their children for support, living with them, helping with childcare and housework in exchange for being cared for. 3-generation households were common. Grandparents lived with their adult children and grandchildren, often in cramped conditions. The grandmother, babushka, played a crucial role. She'd care for the grandchildren while the parents worked. She'd shop, spending hours in lines, but she had the time. She'd cook, clean, manage the household. The grandfather, if he was alive and able, might also help doing repairs, growing vegetables at the dacha. This arrangement benefited everyone in a way. The grandparents had support and purpose. The parents had childcare and household help. The grandchildren had loving caregivers, but it also meant no privacy, constant proximity, inevitable conflicts. Healthcare for the elderly was free, but quality varied. Chronic conditions might not be managed well. Medications were often unavailable. Elderly people suffered from ailments that could have been treated with better medical care. Life expectancy in the Soviet Union, while improving over time, never matched Western levels, partly because of inadequate healthcare for the elderly. Still, elderly people were respected in Soviet culture. There was a tradition of deference to elders, of listening to their stories, of valuing their experience. The generation that survived the war in particular was venerated. Veterans wore their medals on Victory Day, were honored in ceremonies, told their stories to schoolchildren. They were living links to the defining event of Soviet history. Let me tell you about one such veteran. Ivan Stepanovich, the man we met earlier from the village of Nikolskoye, the one who lost his arm at Kursk. By the 1970s, he's in his 70s, retired from collective farm work, living with his wife Anna. His days are quiet. He tends his garden, listens to the radio, walks to the village shop to buy vodka and tobacco. On Victory Day, May 9th, the anniversary of Germany's surrender, Ivan puts on his good suit, pins his medals to his chest. There are many medals: the Order of the Red Star for bravery at Kursk, campaign medals for various battles, the medal for the defense of Moscow. He's proud of these. They represent the best moments of his life, when he was young and strong, when he was part of something larger than himself, when his sacrifice meant something. The village has a celebration. There's a parade to the war memorial, a statue of a soldier with a list of names beneath it, the names of the men from Nikolskoye who died in the war. There are many names. Ivan's friends, men he grew up with. He reads the names every year, remembering. Speeches are given by the kolkhoz chairman, by a representative from the district party committee. They talk about the heroism of the Soviet people, about the importance of remembering the sacrifices, about vigilance against imperialism. It's propaganda, but it's also true in a way. They did sacrifice, they did fight, they did win. After the ceremony, there's a feast. Tables set up in the village club, covered with food and drink. People toast the veterans, thank them, listen to their stories. Ivan drinks vodka, too much vodka, Anna thinks, but she doesn't stop him. It's Victory Day, he's earned it. Ivan tells a story about Kursk, about the moment he lost his arm. A German artillery shell landed near his position. The explosion threw him back. When he came to, his left arm was gone below the elbow, just gone. The pain was incredible. He thought he was going to die, but a medic got to him, stopped the bleeding, got him evacuated. He survived, obviously. He's here telling the story. But sometimes he still feels the missing arm, still feels pain in fingers that no longer exist. Phantom pain, the doctors call it. The young people listen politely, but Ivan can tell they don't really understand. How could they? They've grown up in peace, in relative comfort. They haven't seen what he's seen, haven't done what he's done. The gulf between his generation and theirs is vast. That night, lying in bed next to Anna, Ivan thinks about his life. Was it a good life? He's not sure. He survived the war, which is more than many can say. He worked hard, raised children, saw grandchildren born. He never got rich, never achieved anything remarkable, but he endured. In the Soviet Union, that's an achievement in itself. He dies in his sleep in 1972, his heart finally giving out. He's buried in the village cemetery, next to his parents, with a simple headstone bearing his name and dates. His medals are given to his son Pyotr, who keeps them in a drawer, taking them out occasionally to show his own children. This is the arc of a Soviet life. Birth, childhood, war, work, retirement, death. Millions of lives following similar patterns. Individual stories subsumed into the collective narrative of building socialism, surviving war, enduring hardship. Let's talk about something we haven't explored yet: nationality and ethnicity in the Soviet Union. The USSR called itself a union of equal republics, a family of fraternal peoples. But the reality was more complex and often darker. The Soviet Union contained over 100 ethnic groups. Russians were the largest group, about half the population, but there were Ukrainians, Belarusians, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Moldovans, Tajiks, Turkmen, Kyrgyz, and dozens of smaller groups. The official policy was that nationality didn't matter, that all Soviet citizens were equal. But in practice, Russians dominated. Russian was the language of government, of the military, of advancement. If you wanted to get ahead, you learned Russian. Your own language was fine for home, for local affairs, but for anything important, you needed Russian. Each Soviet republic had its own Communist Party organization, its own government structures. But these were subordinate to Moscow. Real power resided in the Kremlin. The republics had autonomy in theory, but in practice, they followed orders from the center. Some nationalities were trusted more than others. Slavic peoples, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians were at the top of the hierarchy. Baltic peoples were viewed with suspicion because their countries had been independent and were forcibly annexed. Central Asians were seen as backward, in need of Soviet civilization. Caucasians, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis were stereotyped in various ways. And then there were the punished peoples. During World War II, Stalin deported entire nationalities, accusing them of collaborating with the Germans. The Chechens and Ingush were deported from the Caucasus to Central Asia in 1944. The Crimean Tatars were deported from Crimea. The Volga Germans, Kalmucks, Karachays, Balkars, all deported. Hundreds of thousands of people loaded onto cattle cars, shipped to Kazakhstan and Siberia. The deportations were brutal. People were given hours to pack. They were allowed minimal belongings. The journeys took weeks. People died en route from cold, hunger, disease. When they arrived, they were dumped in remote areas with minimal support. Mortality rates were horrific, especially among children and the elderly. These peoples were not allowed to return until the 1950s, after Stalin's death. When they did return, their homes had been taken by others. They had to rebuild their lives from nothing. The trauma of this experience shaped these communities for generations. Let me tell you about Ruslan, a Chechen boy born in Kazakhstan in 1950. His parents were deported from Chechnya in 1944 when they were children themselves. Ruslan grows up in a small town in Kazakhstan, surrounded by other deported Chechens. They maintain their language, their customs, their identity, despite Soviet efforts to assimilate them. Growing up, Ruslan is aware that he's different. He's Chechen, not Russian, not Kazakh. He speaks Chechen at home, Russian at school. He learns about his homeland from stories told by the elders, stories about mountains and forests, about a place he's never seen. In 1957, when Ruslan is 7, Khrushchev allows the deported peoples to return home. Ruslan's family makes the journey back to Chechnya. They find that their old village no longer exists. Russians have been settled there. The houses, the land, everything has been taken. They have to start over, building a new home in a different village. Ruslan's experience of the Soviet Union is very different from a Russian person's. He's constantly reminded that he's a minority, that he's viewed with suspicion. When he applies to university, he faces discrimination. His grades are good, but preference is given to Russians. He ends up at a technical school rather than a university. He becomes an electrician, finds work in Grozny, the Chechen capital. He marries, has children, tries to build a decent life, but he never forgets that his people were deported, punished for crimes they didn't commit. He never fully trusts the Soviet state. This resentment, this historical grievance, exists in many non-Russian communities across the Soviet Union. It's suppressed, kept quiet, but it's there. And when the Soviet Union begins to collapse in the late 1980s, these grievances will resurface with a vengeance. Now let's talk about a topic that many people find fascinating: dissidents and the underground opposition. Throughout Soviet history, there were always people who resisted, who spoke out, who refused to conform. They paid a heavy price for it. In the Stalin era, dissent meant death. You didn't openly oppose the system, you just disappeared. But after Stalin, in the Khrushchev thaw, and especially during the Brezhnev stagnation, a dissident movement emerged. These were people, writers, scientists, artists, activists, who openly criticized the Soviet system, who demanded human rights, who challenged the official ideology. The most famous dissidents include Andrei Sakharov, the nuclear physicist who became a human rights activist; Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose books exposed the Gulag; Natan Sharansky, who campaigned for Jewish immigration rights; Yuri Orlov, who founded the Moscow-Helsinki group to monitor Soviet compliance with human rights agreements; Vladimir Bukovsky, who exposed the use of psychiatric hospitals to imprison dissidents. These people were incredibly brave. They knew the risks. They were harassed, arrested, imprisoned, exiled, sent to psychiatric hospitals where they were forcibly medicated. But they continued speaking out because they believed in truth, in freedom, in human dignity. The KGB dealt with dissidents in various ways. Sometimes arrest and imprisonment, often on fabricated charges like anti-Soviet agitation or parasitism. Sometimes forced emigration, kicking them out of the country. Sometimes psychiatric detention. If you criticize the Soviet system, you must be insane, right? The special psychiatric hospitals, or psikhushkas, were a particularly cruel invention. Dissidents were diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia or other made-up conditions and drugged into submission. But dissidents were a tiny minority. Most Soviet citizens weren't dissidents. Most people just tried to live their lives, to stay out of trouble, to survive. They might privately disagree with the system, might grumble about shortages and bureaucracy, but they didn't openly challenge it. The cost was too high. There was a spectrum. At one end, true believers who genuinely supported the system. At the other end, active dissidents. And in the middle, the vast majority. People who went along to get along, who performed conformity while harboring private doubts, who lived double lives, public face and private face. Let me introduce you to someone in that middle category. Yevgeny, a journalist working for Pravda in the 1970s. Yevgeny is intelligent, well-educated, aware of the contradictions in Soviet society. He reads samizdat when he can get it. He listens to foreign radio broadcasts, Voice of America, BBC, Radio Liberty. He knows the official line he writes in his articles is often propaganda, sometimes outright lies. But he's not a dissident. He doesn't openly challenge the system. He has a family to support. He has a good job. Working for Pravda is prestigious. He has an apartment, a dacha, access to special stores. Why throw that away? For what? For a futile gesture that will accomplish nothing except landing him in prison. So Yevgeny compromises. He writes what he's told to write. He attends party meetings and says the right things. He's careful about who he trusts, what he says, where he says it. In private, with close friends, he might make a cynical joke about the system, but never in public, never on record. This is how most Soviet intellectuals navigated the system. Some people judge them harshly for this. Cowards, collaborators, enablers, but what would you do in their position? It's easy to be brave in hindsight, from the safety of another time and place. Living under totalitarianism requires compromises. Not everyone can be a hero. Yevgeny lives with the cognitive dissonance. He justifies it to himself. I'm doing what I can within the system. I'm supporting my family. I'm not actively hurting anyone. But some nights, he lies awake wondering if he sold his soul, if his compromises have made him complicit in the system's crimes. He'll never resolve this. When the Soviet Union collapses, he'll feel a mixture of relief and loss. Relief that the lies are over. Loss because the system, flawed as it was, gave his life structure and meaning. In the chaos of the 1990s, he'll look back on the Soviet years with a complicated nostalgia. Let's talk about religion, which we've touched on but haven't explored deeply. The Soviet Union was officially atheist. Marxist-Leninist ideology held that religion was the opiate of the masses, a tool used by the ruling class to keep workers docile. The Bolsheviks saw religion as backward, superstitious, incompatible with scientific socialism. In the early Soviet period, the state attacked religion aggressively. Churches, mosques, and synagogues were closed or destroyed. Priests, rabbis, imams were arrested or executed. Religious education was banned. Believers were persecuted. The 1920s and 1930s saw a massive campaign to eliminate religion from Soviet life. But religion didn't die. It went underground. People continued to believe, to practice their faith in secret. Grandmothers taught their grandchildren prayers. Icons were hidden. Priests performed clandestine services in private homes. Religion survived in the margins, in the spaces the state couldn't fully control. During World War II, Stalin reopened some churches. He needed to rally the people, and religious sentiment was too strong to completely suppress. The Russian Orthodox Church was allowed to function again under state control. Priests were monitored by the KGB. The church hierarchy was infiltrated by informers, but services were held, Barbies were baptized, weddings were blessed. By the later Soviet period, religion existed in a complicated limbo. Officially, the state was atheist. Party members weren't supposed to be religious. But many people, especially in rural areas and among older generations, continued to practice. They might not go to church regularly, there weren't many functioning churches, but they observed holidays, kept icons, believed in God. Let me tell you about Olga Dmitrievna, an old woman living in Moscow in the 1980s. She's in her 80s, a survivor of so much: the revolution, the civil war, collectivization, the purges, the war. She lost her husband in the war, raised 3 children alone, worked in a factory for 40 years. Now she's retired, living with her daughter's family. Olga is a believer. She was baptized as a baby before the revolution. She's kept her faith her entire life, through decades when admitting it could cost you dearly. She has an icon corner in her bedroom, hidden behind a curtain. She prays daily. On Easter, she bakes kulik, the traditional Easter bread, decorates eggs. She goes to church when she can. There's a functioning Russian Orthodox church in Moscow, several actually, always packed with elderly women like herself. Her daughter and son-in-law are party members, atheists officially, but they tolerate Olga's faith. They even eat her Easter kulik, enjoy the tradition, though they don't acknowledge its religious significance. Her grandchildren are being raised atheist, taught in school that religion is superstition. But they love their babushka and they see her devotion, and some of them are curious. After the Soviet Union collapses, some of them will explore religion, reclaim a heritage that was suppressed for 3 generations. Islam in the Soviet Union had a similar experience. In Central Asia and the Caucasus, Islam was deeply rooted. The Bolsheviks tried to eliminate it, closing mosques, persecuting clergy, banning traditional practices. But Islam survived, especially in rural areas. People continued to observe Ramadan, to celebrate Eid, to pray 5 times a day, all in secret. The Soviet state created official Muslim institutions, controlled by the KGB, to give the appearance of religious tolerance while actually monitoring and controlling believers. But unofficial Islam thrived in parallel. Sufi brotherhoods operated underground. Islamic education happened in secret. Faith persisted. Judaism faced particular challenges. Jews were recognized as a nationality in the Soviet Union, not just a religion. You had Jew stamped on your internal passport. This marked you, created obstacles. Jews faced discrimination in education, in employment, in housing. Many Jews wanted to emigrate to Israel or the West, but emigration was severely restricted until the 1970s, when international pressure led to some easing. The refuseniks, Jews who applied to emigrate but were refused permission, became a cause célèbre in the West. People like Natan Sharansky, who spent 9 years in Soviet prisons and labor camps for his activism. Eventually, many Jews did emigrate, especially in the late Soviet period and after the collapse. This brain drain included scientists, artists, musicians, entrepreneurs, a significant loss for the Soviet Union and later for Russia. Let's shift topics and talk about something lighter: food and cuisine in the Soviet Union. Food was a constant preoccupation. Not food as pleasure, not gourmet dining, but food as survival, as a daily challenge. The Soviet diet was heavy on starches: bread, potatoes, pasta, kasha, buckwheat porridge. These were cheap, filling, available. Meat was expensive and often scarce. When it was available, it was often poor quality, fatty, gristly. Sausage was a staple, more reliable than fresh meat, though what was actually in the sausage was questionable. Dairy products were important: milk, sour cream, cottage cheese. Butter was precious. Cheese was a luxury. Eggs were usually available, though you might have to wait in line for them. Vegetables were seasonal. In summer and fall there were fresh tomatoes, cucumbers, cabbage, beets, carrots. In winter you ate preserved vegetables, sauerkraut, pickles, salted tomatoes. Fresh produce in winter was rare and expensive. Fruit was a treat. Apples were common, but oranges, bananas, tropical fruits were rare. When a store got a shipment of oranges, word spread instantly. People would drop whatever they were doing and rush to get in line. You'd buy as many as you could, even if you didn't need them right away, because you didn't know when you'd see oranges again. Soviet cuisine featured dishes that were practical, economical, designed to feed a family on limited resources. Borscht, beetroot soup with cabbage, potatoes, sometimes meat. Shchi, cabbage soup. Solyanka, a hearty soup with meat or fish, pickles, lemon. Blini, thin pancakes that could be filled with various things. Pelmeni, dumplings filled with meat. These dishes are delicious, genuinely. Soviet cuisine at its best is comfort food, hearty and satisfying. The problem wasn't the recipes, it was the availability of ingredients. Making a proper borscht requires beef, beets, cabbage, potatoes, tomatoes, onions, sour cream. Getting all these ingredients at the same time was a challenge. Eating out was uncommon. Restaurants existed but were expensive and often not very good. The service was terrible: surly waiters, long waits, limited menus. Why pay to eat mediocre food served by someone who clearly doesn't want to be there when you could eat at home? There were cafeterias, stolovias attached to workplaces, schools, institutions. These served cheap, basic meals. The food was edible but not exciting. Still, it was affordable, and for many people, the midday meal at the cafeteria was the best meal of the day. For special occasions, birthdays, holidays, people would go all out. They'd save for weeks, scrounge for ingredients, prepare elaborate meals. A birthday table might feature salads: Olivier salad, vinaigrette, herring under fur coat, cold cuts, pickles, bread, a main dish like roast chicken or pork, and cake. Vodka, of course, lots of vodka. Drinking culture in the Soviet Union deserves its own discussion. Vodka was ubiquitous. It was the social lubricant, the way men bonded, the way celebrations were marked, the way sorrows were drowned. Alcoholism was a serious problem, though official statistics understated it. Men would drink after work, on weekends, at parties, at funerals, at weddings, at any excuse. Drinking to excess was normalized, even celebrated. A real man could hold his vodka. Toasts were elaborate, poetic, emotional. First toast to meeting, second toast to friendship, third toast to love, fourth toast to women, and so on until everyone was drunk. Women drank less generally, but they drank too. Alcoholism among women was more stigmatized, but it existed. The toll of alcoholism on Soviet society was immense: broken families, workplace accidents, health problems, premature deaths. The state had a complicated relationship with alcohol. Vodka sales generated significant revenue, but alcoholism hurt productivity, created social problems. Gorbachev, when he came to power, launched an anti-alcohol campaign, restricting sales, raising prices, cutting production. It was unpopular and largely ineffective. People just made their own alcohol, samogon, moonshine, which was often dangerous. Let's talk about another aspect of daily life: transportation. The Soviet Union built impressive public transportation systems in major cities. The Moscow metro, which we've mentioned, was efficient, clean, beautiful. Trains ran frequently. Stations were works of art. It was a point of pride. Trams, trolleybuses, and buses served cities and towns. The vehicles were often old, crowded, uncomfortable, but they ran regularly and were cheap. Most people didn't own cars. Car ownership was a luxury available only to a small percentage of the population. If you wanted a car, you had to join a waiting list. You might wait years. When your name finally came up, you'd buy whatever was available, usually a Lada or a Moskvich, Soviet-made cars that were not great. They broke down frequently. Parts were hard to get. You became your own mechanic out of necessity. Still, having a car was freedom. You could drive to the dacha. You could take trips. You could avoid the crowded public transport. Cars were status symbols, signs that you'd made it. Intercity travel was mostly by train. The Soviet rail system was extensive, connecting even remote areas. Trains were slow but reliable. Long-distance journeys meant spending nights on the train, sleeping in bunks in shared compartments, making tea from the samovar in the corridor, watching the landscape roll by for hours or days. Flying was possible but not common. Aeroflot, the state airline, operated domestic and international flights. The planes were Soviet-made, Tupolov's Ilyushins, and had a reputation for being less safe than Western aircraft. Still, if you needed to travel a long distance quickly, flying was the only option. Travel abroad was severely restricted for ordinary citizens. You needed special permission, which was rarely granted. The state worried that people would defect, so most Soviet citizens never left the country. Their world was bounded by the Soviet borders. They knew about other countries only through propaganda and whatever illicit information they could glean from foreign radio broadcasts or smuggled books. This isolation was deliberate. The state wanted to control information, to prevent comparisons with the West, because if people knew how much better life was in Western countries, they might start asking uncomfortable questions. But some information leaked through. Sailors and diplomats who traveled abroad brought back stories, contraband goods. Foreign films, though rare, showed glimpses of Western life. The Beatles, blue jeans, Coca-Cola became symbols of a forbidden world, all the more alluring because they were forbidden. Young people especially were drawn to Western culture. They wanted rock music, fashionable clothes, freedom of expression. This created a generational divide. The older generation, shaped by war and hardship, were more accepting of Soviet austerity. The younger generation, who'd grown up in relative stability, wanted more. This tension would contribute to the Soviet Union's collapse. By the 1980s, the system was losing legitimacy, especially among the young. They could see increasingly that the official propaganda was lies. They wanted change. Now, as we're approaching the end of this extensive journey through Soviet life, I want to take a moment to thank you for sticking with us. If you found this exploration of history valuable, please consider hitting that subscribe button for Dreamless Timelines. We create these detailed historical narratives to help you relax, learn, and drift off to sleep with something meaningful in your mind. Drop a comment below. We love hearing your thoughts, your family stories, your perspectives. Your engagement truly matters to us. Let's talk about the final years of the Soviet Union, the period from the mid-1980s to 1991. These are dramatic years, years when history accelerates, when the seemingly permanent Soviet system suddenly fractures and collapses. Mikhail Gorbachev becomes General Secretary of the Communist Party in March 1985. He's 54, relatively young for a Soviet leader. He's energetic, charismatic, intelligent. He recognizes that the Soviet system is in crisis. The economy is stagnating. Technology is falling behind the West. The war in Afghanistan is a quagmire. Something needs to change. Gorbachev introduces two key concepts, glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost means openness, transparency. Gorbachev loosens censorship, allows more freedom of speech and press. Suddenly, newspapers are publishing articles that would have been unthinkable just years before, articles about corruption, about the Stalinist past, about current problems. Television becomes more interesting. There are talk shows where people actually debate. There are investigative reports exposing official malfeasance. It's exhilarating. People are glued to their TVs, reading newspapers voraciously, discussing politics openly for the first time in decades. Perestroika means restructuring. Gorbachev wants to reform the Soviet economy, to introduce elements of market mechanisms while maintaining socialism. He allows some private enterprise, cooperatives, more autonomy for state enterprises. The idea is to make the economy more efficient, more responsive to consumer needs. But perestroika doesn't work as planned. The reforms are half measures, creating confusion and disruption without solving fundamental problems. The economy actually gets worse. Shortages intensify. Inflation rises. People's frustration grows. Archives open. Historians and journalists dig into the Soviet past, publishing documents about Stalin's crimes, about the Gulag, about the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Each revelation chips away at the legitimacy of the system. If the party lied about this, what else have they lied about? Everything. Political prisoners are released. Andrei Sakharov, the physicist and dissident who'd been exiled to Gorky, is allowed to return to Moscow. He becomes a voice for reform, for democracy. Other dissidents are freed, rehabilitated. This signals that the old ways are ending. But Gorbachev is trying to reform the system while preserving it. He wants a better Soviet Union, not its destruction. But the forces he's unleashed are beyond his control. Nationalist movements erupt across the Soviet Union. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, people form human chains stretching hundreds of kilometers, demanding independence. In the Caucasus, Armenia and Azerbaijan fight over Nagorno-Karabakh, an ethnic Armenian enclave in Azerbaijan. In Central Asia, ethnic violence breaks out in several republics. The Soviet Union, held together by force for 70 years, is coming apart. In Moscow, political reformers like Boris Yeltsin push for more radical change. Yeltsin, once a party insider, becomes a champion of Russian independence from Soviet control. It's a strange situation. The Russian Republic, the heart of the Soviet Union, declaring sovereignty from the union it dominates. The Communist Party's monopoly on power ends. Other political parties form. Elections become competitive. The Congress of People's Deputies, elected in 1989, includes actual opposition figures. The debates are broadcast on television. People watch fascinated as deputies openly criticize the government, as real political discourse happens for the first time. In Eastern Europe, the satellite states break free. Poland holds free elections in 1989. Solidarity, the independent trade union, wins. Hungary opens its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to escape to the west. The Berlin Wall falls in November 1989, crowds tearing it down with hammers and bare hands while East German guards stand by, unsure what to do. The Soviet Union doesn't intervene. Under Brezhnev, the Soviet Union would have sent tanks, but Gorbachev lets Eastern Europe go. The Brezhnev Doctrine, the idea that the Soviet Union would intervene to preserve communist rule in its satellites, is dead. By 1990, the Soviet Union is in crisis. The economy is collapsing. Ethnic conflicts rage. Republics are declaring sovereignty. The Communist Party is discredited. Gorbachev's popularity has plummeted. People blame him for the chaos, even though he's trying to manage an impossible situation. In Russia, Boris Yeltsin is elected president in June 1991, the first democratically elected leader in Russian history. This creates a dual power situation. Gorbachev as president of the Soviet Union, Yeltsin as president of the Russian Republic. Their rivalry will shape the final months of the Soviet Union. In August 1991, hardline communists attempt a coup. They're opposed to Gorbachev's reforms, want to restore the old order. They place Gorbachev under house arrest at his dacha in Crimea. They declare a state of emergency. They send tanks into Moscow. But the coup fails. Boris Yeltsin defies the plotters, standing on a tank outside the Russian parliament, rallying opposition. Ordinary Muscovites come out to support him, building barricades facing down the tanks. The military splits. Some units support the coup, others don't. After 3 tense days, the coup collapses. The plotters are arrested. Gorbachev returns to Moscow, but his authority is gone. Yeltsin is the hero. The Communist Party is discredited beyond repair. Yeltsin bans it in Russia. Over the following months, the Soviet republics declare independence one by one. Ukraine votes for independence in December 1991, a devastating blow because Ukraine is the second largest republic. The Baltic states have already left. The Central Asian republics are going. Even Belarus, always loyal, declares independence. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus meet in a forest in Belarus. They sign an agreement dissolving the Soviet Union and creating the Commonwealth of Independent States. Gorbachev isn't consulted. He finds out about it on television. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigns as president of the Soviet Union. That evening, the red Hamayansikal flag is lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Russian tricolor is raised in its place. The Soviet Union is over. 74 years of history ended just like that. For people living through this, it's surreal. The Soviet Union seemed permanent, eternal. The idea that it could simply cease to exist was unthinkable, but it happened. The reactions are mixed. Some people celebrate. Finally, freedom. Finally, democracy. Finally, a chance to build a normal life. Young people especially are optimistic. They believe the future will be better. Others are terrified. What happens now? The Soviet system, for all its flaws, provided security. Free healthcare, free education, guaranteed employment, subsidized housing. Now all that's gone. The future is uncertain. Older people especially feel lost. Their entire lives were shaped by the Soviet system. They fought in its wars, worked in its factories, believed in its promises. Now they're told it was all a lie, all a mistake. It's devastating. The 1990s in Russia are catastrophic. The economy collapses. GDP drops by 40%. Hyperinflation wipes out savings. State enterprises are privatized, often corruptly, creating a class of oligarchs, former Communist Party officials and criminals who get rich while everyone else suffers. Pensions aren't paid for months. Salaries aren't paid. People barter, sell possessions, do whatever they can to survive. Crime explodes. The mafia takes over whole sectors. Contract killings become common. Life expectancy drops. Male life expectancy falls to 58 years, a level not seen since the 1960s. It's a humanitarian disaster, and it happens while the West celebrates the triumph of capitalism over communism. For ordinary Russians, it doesn't feel like a triumph. It feels like the end of the world. But slowly, gradually, things stabilize. By the late 1990s and especially the 2000s, the Russian economy recovers, driven by oil and gas exports. Living standards rise, a middle class emerges. Moscow and other major cities become modern, with shopping malls, restaurants, all the consumer goods that were scarce in Soviet times. But the trauma of the 1990s shapes Russian politics and society. Many people are nostalgic for the Soviet Union, remembering it as a time of stability and security. This nostalgia is selective. People remember the good parts, forget the bad parts, but it's real. When Vladimir Putin comes to power in 2000, promising to restore order and national pride, many Russians support him. They're tired of chaos. They want stability, even if it means less freedom. So what's the legacy of the Soviet Union? It's complicated. The Soviet Union achieved remarkable things: rapid industrialization, victory in World War II, space exploration, universal literacy, guaranteed employment, social welfare. These were real achievements. But the cost was horrific. The purges, the gulag, the famines, the suppression of freedom. Millions died, millions more suffered. Entire peoples were deported. Cultures were suppressed. Individuality was crushed. The system was built on coercion and fear. And in the end, it failed. The Soviet experiment in building communism didn't create a workers' paradise. It created a society that was repressive, inefficient, and ultimately unsustainable. When the system finally collapsed, it left behind economic ruin and social dislocation. For the people who lived through it, people like Mikhail Petrov, whose story opened our journey, like his son Sasha, like his granddaughter Natasha, the Soviet Union was their lives. It shaped who they were, what they believed, how they lived. They made the best of difficult circumstances. They found moments of joy and love and meaning, even in a flawed system. Their stories are worth remembering, not to glorify the Soviet Union, not to condemn it, but to understand it. To understand what it meant to live under that system. To understand the choices people made, the compromises they accepted, the dreams they held onto. History is not just about the grand narratives, revolutions, wars, the rise and fall of empires. History is also about ordinary people living ordinary lives, navigating the systems they're born into, trying to survive, trying to find happiness, trying to make sense of their existence. The Soviet Union was one such system. It existed. Hundreds of millions of people lived in it. Their experiences were real, their struggles were real, their hopes and fears and loves and losses were real. And now, as you drift off to sleep, think about those lives. Think about Mikhail taken away in the night. Think about Natasha standing in lines. Think about Sasha surviving the orphanage. Think about the millions whose names we don't know, whose stories weren't told, who lived and died in obscurity. They were human beings just like us. They laughed and cried. They worked and rested. They loved and lost. They were trying, like all of us, to make a life worth living. That's the real story of the Soviet Union. Not the ideology, not the politics, not the grand achievements or terrible crimes. The real story is the people, always the people. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Soviet history. Thank you for listening to these stories. If you found this valuable, if it helped you understand a little more about this strange and fascinating period of history, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. We create these long-form historical narratives because we believe history matters, because we believe stories matter, because we believe understanding the past helps us make sense of the present. Sleep well, dream well, and remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding ourselves, our world, and the choices we face today. Until next time, this is Dreamless Timelines, wishing you peaceful rest and meaningful dreams.